Morning, everybody. It's 9 o'clock. We like to start on time, so. Wow, that really worked. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today for the second biennial Preble Street Conference on Homelessness. We're really excited to have you with us, and we're excited and ready to get started. So. We'll do so. My name is Mark Swann. I'm the Executive Director of Preble Street, and it's my job this morning, my pleasure really, to welcome you all here today. We have 300 people registered for this conference, which we're thrilled about. We have representing or from 50 different communities in Maine. Which is great. I actually just heard we have 8 people from the city of Auburn. So thank you to our friends from Auburn. And I'm sure we have a lot of people from Portland and Augusta, so don't feel bad that I didn't mention you. But I think that this representation certainly speaks to the statewide impact of homelessness in Maine. We have quite a few nonprofits represented here today. I mentioned the municipalities that are here. We're grateful to have a number of elected officials with us this morning. And we have many, many advocates and people with lived experience with us as well. So thank you all for being here and for lending your big hearts and big brains to this conference. A very quick thank you to our generous sponsors who help make this possible. The Preble Street Board of Directors, the Atlantic Charitable Fund, Avesta Housing, Maine Housing, Genesis Community Loan Fund, and Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare. I also want to thank the Conference Steering Committee who helped craft this year's agenda. This committee made the decision for this conference, different than the last one, to reach out to other communities around the country and invite smart, committed, and proven leaders in their fields to join us today to talk about what works in their town, in their city, in their state. We have a lot to learn from them. We have colleagues here from Dallas, Texas, Richmond, Virginia, Rockford, Illinois, Seattle, Washington, and Washington, D.C. They'll all be together up here in a panel this morning, and all of them will also be participating in workshops this afternoon. They'll be here all day among us and with us, so I encourage you to reach out to them, introduce yourself, make them feel welcome here in Maine, and don't be shy about asking questions. That's why they're here. So thank you to all of them for making the trip here, and of course they'll be introduced just a little bit later. I thought I would start by grounding us a little bit with a reminder of the responsibility we all have to people who are experiencing homelessness. There are many, many people and many organizations and institutions that carry that responsibility, of course, far more than are in this room today. But I think it's the 300 people in this room, by virtue of being here, by virtue of the advocacy so many of you do, by virtue of the day-to-day really important work many of you do. You are the leaders in acting on our collective responsibility, acting on it. By being present here today, also by paying attention every day and by thoughtfully and intentionally connecting the dots between the tragedy of homelessness and the racial inequities, social determinants of health, gentrification pressures, and widening economic inequities that cause homelessness. You are the group of people that I'm most optimistic about that can make change, that can end homelessness. And I know that's why you're here, to end homelessness. There's great work, without question, there's great work being done all over Maine by nonprofits, by government agencies, volunteer groups, faith-based groups, peer networks, and good old-fashioned activists and community organizers. Lots of impressive work, so thank you, all of you, for what you're doing. Having said that, and believing that, we do need to do better here in Maine. There's no question about it. I suspect everyone in this room agrees on that. One awful and pretty obvious indicator of the need to do better is the number of people in our state who are unsheltered, who are sleeping outdoors in encampments, in doorways on main streets, and in parks and under bridges. A few of us met last night and we were talking about a time not that long ago in this state when it was extremely rare to see somebody sleeping outside. Changed maybe 6 or 7 years ago. Pre-pandemic is when it really started to change. That indicator of unsheltered folks is extremely visible. It certainly has raised awareness, sometimes in a productive way, other times not so much. But nonetheless, it is an indicator that is tragic, it's heartbreaking, and to me, it tells us that we need to do more and we need to do better. And I know many other people believe that. Probably everybody in this audience believes that. I guess I'd say that there's a lot of talk about homelessness, right? More than ever. There's talk in the media, talk at city and town councils, at the legislature, at neighborhood groups and associations, lots and lots of talk, lots of opinions. There's a lot of finger pointing and blaming. Pretty much every day, don't we hear shame and blame laid at the feet of the people themselves experiencing homelessness? That refrain, it seems to me, used to be along the lines of get a job. I can remember a school bus of kids driving by our soup kitchen many years ago, and the kids chanting that out the window to folks in line for our soup kitchen. Get a job. Then it was kind of move on, and now it's, you can't sleep here or you'll be arrested. That's happening more and more in our communities and across the country. As if their lives were not challenging enough, this is the playlist that people experiencing homelessness hear every day. And service providers, I think we certainly get far more than our share of very public blaming and shaming. I know some folks in this room have been through painful planning board public hearings. You know what I'm talking about. And all that noise, all that blaming and shaming is the nature now, sadly, of doing anti-poverty work. And even more sad, of course, is the reality that vulnerable people live with every single day in a world that seems to be replacing its collective compassion with hate and bullying and divisiveness. Today, we're going to hear many potential solutions, some of which I think you'll think are great, and maybe some not so much. You might even think they're a waste of time or resources in our community. But I would say, in my opinion, the biggest waste of time is the extraordinary amounts of time we spend in meetings, in task forces, on committees, spending time on process, when we really should be focused on what the best solutions are for the people we are serving. And frankly, in the public sector, I think it can be equally as frustrating and just as unproductive, especially between the different levels of government. I have witnessed it over and over and over again where public officials deflect responsibility from whatever level of government they are currently representing. Many local officials blame the state for not doing enough, and state officials often push it back as a local problem. And nothing gets accomplished in that scenario. It's a very common scenario. I think Maine needs desperately to get to a place where all of that time and energy, wasted time and energy, spent by those of us in the nonprofit and public sectors, and instead spend it in productive action to make things better, to achieve better outcomes, to get shit done. Did he just say, get shit done on a microphone? I did. I did. I think we have to get real about this. We need to get shit done, and we need to do it together, and we can do it. One of my favorite quotes is by Cicero, a Roman orator and statesman, who I'm pretty sure never said get shit done in his career. But what he did say is a quote I love. He said, "I criticize by what I create." I love it. I love that quote. I have it printed out and on my desk at work. And one outcome I'm really hoping for this conference is that we take a step back from criticizing and instead create solutions. It is a lot harder to create and build things than it is to criticize and tear things down. Much, much harder. But I also know it's not impossible. It's definitely not, despite my frustrations and I think others. It is also undeniable that smart and sustainable solutions have been created in Maine or are in the process of being created. I think probably all of us can point to this program or that program or some new housing that got built or some new approach. Just a few examples of many. I would point out in Brunswick, where the Tedford housing is expanding critically needed shelter beds. In Biddeford, where the city invited developers of the affordable housing that had been rejected by the town of Cumberland to come to Biddeford to build it. I agree. Pretty great. And throughout Maine, where Preble Street Veterans Housing Services housed 297 veterans last year. I think that's great. In Orland, our peers at Home Inc. expanded their shelter to provide low-barrier services during the pandemic, like so many other shelters did in Maine, and are trying hard to keep that going. In Portland, where CHOM is building affordable housing for Maine's aging population, like Phoenix Flats, as well as regularly prioritizing a set-aside of apartments for people experiencing homelessness. From our allies at Maine's Department of Health and Human Services, after years of advocacy and creativity and hard work, we have new home funds that are starting to expand around the state, where we'll be able to access Medicaid dollars to pay for outreach and services, support services for people on the street and in shelters. Could really be a big game changer. And I'll call out Governor Mills. She worked really closely with legislative leadership this past session to find state funding to support and keep open the 5 low-barrier shelters in Maine. And in doing so, she ensured that the second largest shelter in the state, Hope House in Bangor, remains open. Another example near and dear to my heart is the upcoming scaling of site-based housing first. And for those of you who don't know the story, I think it's worth a brief recap. So 20 years ago, this coming March actually, Preble Street and Avesta Housing, working with Portland Housing Authority, we all worked hand in hand to open Logan Place. It was the first site-based housing, first apartment in northern New England. And the genesis of it all started when a bunch of social workers just got tired of hosting sad little memorial services in our soup kitchen for those who had died on the streets and in shelters. We were doing far too many of those memorial services. So we decided to try something different, take a risk. We kind of turned the housing readiness model, remember that? Kind of turned that on its head, and we opened Logan Place after about 5 years of hard work and planning. It was an immediate and demonstrable success. We had wicked high expectations, and we met them or exceeded them. Shelter numbers went down in Portland. A robust cost-benefit analysis proved its efficiency, and most importantly, the lives of chronically homeless people who had lived for years and years, decades even, on the street, finally had a home of their own. We followed up Logan Place with Florence House about 5 years later, and then Houston Commons 6 years after that. But in reality, it was not really a replicable model because there was very, very little public funding for the critically important 24/7 support services. In fact, I lost track of the numbers of folks, maybe some people in this room, who came and visited us at Logan Place or Houston Commons, nonprofits and municipalities who wanted to do a Housing First project. And they would come down, we would give tours, they would meet with tenants, we would share our stories, we'd share our cost-benefit study for their advocacy purposes, we would give policies and procedures. Their excitement level would go up and up and up, and then we'd share our budget. And they would all go, oh. It just stopped in its tracks. We have to raise several hundreds of thousands of dollars each and every year to keep the doors open in our Housing First programs. And a lot of agencies cannot do that. It was really frustrating that this tried and true model that at this point now, I mean, it's amazing. It's now considered best practice at the national level. It's recognized as the single most effective intervention in solving chronic entrenched homelessness, but we couldn't get traction in Maine. Well, the reason I'm telling that backstory is because that frustration started to change into hope at this conference 2 years ago. 2 years ago here, the governor's senior advisor on housing, Greg Payne, got up and he really drew a line in the sand and challenged the attendees of that conference to get shit done. Well, no, he didn't say that. He actually said, and I'm quoting him, he said, "The problem is that the pace at which we are getting these desperately needed and highly successful properties up and running is not nearly good enough. I think that the question should become less about anticipating the 4th or 5th Housing First project in 2030, but instead focusing on opening the next 10, 11, or 12 Housing First properties in the next 5 or 6 years. We should focus on prioritizing that, and I think we can achieve it." So Greg challenged us to create, not just criticize. And we did. Many, many people worked together. Again, many of you are in this room, across sectors, across disciplines, across geographic and political boundaries, and we're able to create a brand new funding stream to support the 24/7 social work services at site-based Housing First programs. These new funds over the next few years will allow 12 to 16 new Housing First developments to open across the state. That's real, that's very productive action, and it will undeniably make a difference. So while it's a 20-year story in some ways, or even longer, it is undeniable to me that the successful push to bring it to scale in Maine happened right here at this conference. So that's what makes me optimistic about all of us in this room and this day. I know good work's being done, good things can be accomplished. We do just need to work harder. We need to work more. We need to focus on being productive and action-oriented and get shit done. I cannot wait to be here 2 years from now at our next conference and tell a similar story of what started here today, what seed of an idea was planted, and how this was a productive day as well and led to good and important things. So thank you, all of you, for being here. I'm sure we're going to have a great day together. I appreciate you being here. Thank you. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Jeff Olivet and welcome him to Maine. Jeff serves as the Executive Director of the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness, or USICH. Jeff was appointed by President Biden, and in his role is the point person on homelessness for the White House. In December of 2022, Jeff oversaw the release of All In, the federal strategic plan to prevent and end homelessness. We're so happy he's here in Maine. Clearly, he recognizes the importance of not only spending time in big cities and states, but appreciates the importance of those of us doing in smaller states who are doing critical work but are not necessarily in the national spotlight. His agency is the only federal agency with the sole purpose of preventing and ending homelessness in the U.S. And in that role, he coordinates with 19 other federal agencies to use their programs and investments the smartest way possible. In his role, Jeff has made significant efforts to reframe homelessness as a public health crisis. Thank you for that. He's amplified the voice of people who have experienced homelessness, worked to eliminate racial disparities, and scaling effective housing and support services while also trying to go upstream to prevent homelessness. He's also no stranger to this work. He has street cred. He has Preble Street cred. We just learned last night he did a training at Preble Street 15 or 20 years ago. It was the best training we ever had, Jeff.
You didn't remember.
I didn't remember it. I didn't. He's worked in this field for more than 25 years as a street outreach worker, as a case manager, coalition builder, researcher, and trainer. He's the founder of Joe Consulting, co-founder of Racial Equity Partners, and from 2010 to 2018, he served as CEO of C4 Innovations. He's deeply committed to social justice, racial equity, gender equality, and inclusion for all. He has a bachelor's degree from University of Alabama and a master's degree from Boston College. Please join me in welcoming Jeff Olivet. Thank you, Jeff.
Good morning, everybody. It is really, really good to be with you today. Of all the places in the world you could be right now, you chose to be here. Whether you came from Rockford or Seattle or Dallas or Augusta or Bangor or Auburn or right here in Portland, you made a choice to be here today, and I'm really, really glad you did. What an incredible group of faces out there. What an incredible body of work you all do and represent. Before I really get into my comments, I'd like to pose a question for you. And that question is, why did you choose to be here now? Why did you choose to be in this room today?
To see you.
And I'm going to, I hope I don't disappoint. I'm going to ask you to turn to one of your neighbors and just talk about that question for a minute. Why are you here? All right? Talk amongst yourselves for a couple minutes, then we'll come back together. All right. Again, thank you for being here. Thank you for making the choice to be here. Whether you are an advocate who has your own lived experience of homelessness, whether you're a direct service provider who is out there walking beside people every day during some of their toughest moments of their lives, whether you are in leadership in a nonprofit organization, or if you're a city or state official or an elected official, whatever you do, whatever your role is in this work, what you do matters every single day. It is making a huge difference. If you just look around at this room, there are 300 of you, probably twice what you had 2 years ago, it sounds like. You all have friends and colleagues back in your communities who are holding the fort down today, who are doing the work while those of us who are in this room have the honor to be together. You should also know that you are part of a much larger movement around this country that involves thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people like you who are coming together in communities large and small, in rural areas and tribal areas, in big cities and suburbs, every day to do the work of ending homelessness in the United States. And whether you've been in this work for 6 months, 6 years, 31 years, like some of us have been, we need all of you. We need lots of people who have their own personal experiences of homelessness and recovery and reconnection. We need people who have degrees and letters behind their names. We need people from the faith community and the business community and government and everybody at this table. What you do now is as hard as it's ever been. I used to be an outreach worker and a case manager many years ago, and it was hard. It was hard in the 90s. It's harder now. The challenges you all face are immense. We as a nation, we as a globe, have survived a terrible pandemic that has taken the lives of people we love, that has I think, deepened some of the political rifts we have in this country, that has in some ways made the world a meaner place, not a kinder place. We know the housing markets that we face are tough right now. And that's not just true in San Francisco and New York and Seattle anymore. It's true in your state as well. The cost of the average apartment here in Portland is about $17,500 a month, and sorry, a year, not a month. That's more like New York. And I may be mixing up the numbers. I think the numbers my comms team gave me was that the average or minimum wage is about $27,000 a year here, and the cost of an apartment is $20,000. That number just doesn't add up. We know that you've got more than 4,000 people experiencing homelessness on any given night in Maine. That number's tripled in the last 4 or 5 years, and that you need something like 80,000 units of new housing to meet the need. And I don't have a magic wand on that. What I do have is some perspective on that, and I can share with you some of what we're trying to do at the national level. But that gap between the housing need and the housing supply is as large as it's been in 50 years in Maine and across the nation. When I was born in 1971, we had a surplus of affordable housing in this nation. We had more than we needed. Can you imagine that? And now we have a deficit, according to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, of more than 7 million units of affordable housing. That's the hole we are in. And it's taken us 50 years to get there. What that says to me is that it hasn't always been this way. It doesn't have to be this way. And we can find our way out of this mess. Mark led us off with a quote from Cicero. I've got a quote for you in Latin. I looked up while you guys were talking how Cicero would have said, "Get shit done." And that goes something like, "Adepto stercore factum." That's "get shit done" in Latin. I just thought I'd share that with you. The only way that we can get this done, that we can solve homelessness, is by coming together. I have become convinced over my 30 years in homelessness work and my last 3 years as a federal bureaucrat that the only way we can do this is by coming together. When we've got people pointing fingers at each other, city people saying, if only the state would do this, state people saying, if only the feds would do this, the nonprofit community pointing at the elected officials, the business community complaining about people being homeless on their doorstep, finger pointing doesn't work. When we point fingers across the political spectrum and say, those people over there, or those people over there, it just divides. If we can come together around some basic values, around what kind of society we want to live in, around a belief that it is never acceptable for one person to be homeless for one night in the richest country in the history of the world, can't we agree on that value? Can't we agree on the value of housing as a basic human right? Not something to be earned, not something you have to jump through 20 hoops to get to, not something to be rationed, but a basic human right. We know that housing is the foundation for everything else, for sobriety, for getting and keeping a job, for connecting with friends and family, for feeling a sense of worth and identity. Having that door you can lock with your own bathroom to go to whenever you want, with your own kitchen to cook a pot of rice in, to have the privacy and the safety and the security of a place to live, that is the basic foundation for all of us. It's the starting point. Now, we also know that housing alone is not always enough. Many of us need a lot of support. And it's really great to hear about the state funding for wraparound supports, for 24/7 services in permanent supportive housing and Housing First. That is what makes it work. It's not housing or services, it's both. And when we look at what really works around Housing First, it's that combination of permanent, stable housing with really good supports. That is what works. You're facing other challenges. We know that there is a real intersection of lots of newly arrived folks to this country who are moving here for opportunity, moving here for safety, moving here for a new life for their children. And some communities are welcoming folks with open arms, and some are pretty angry about it. This is a nation that was built on immigration. It's also a nation that was built on the genocide and land theft of indigenous peoples' land and lives. It was built on the backs of black people who were enslaved for hundreds of years. All of those factors have made a scenario in which people of color are way more likely than their white peers to become homeless. And if we don't acknowledge that reality, if we're not willing to have the courageous conversations around race and racism in this country, if we're not willing to change our systems to achieve more equitable outcomes, then we are never going to solve this. So while the challenges of racism and of anti-immigration thought and rhetoric exist, we've got to come together around those beliefs that everyone deserves housing, that we are a nation big enough and wealthy enough to take care of everyone. That's what we have to come together around. We also know that the crisis of unsheltered homelessness is as severe as we've seen since the Great Depression in this country. And you've seen that here in Maine in recent years. We're seeing it from Maine to New Mexico to Honolulu to Seattle to Los Angeles. We're also seeing tremendous progress on unsheltered homelessness. We've got friends here from Dallas. Dallas has shown something like a 19% reduction in unsheltered homelessness in the last year. And it's not from shying away from it, it's from going right at it, saying it's unacceptable, it's unhealthy, it's unsafe for people to be living in encampments, for people to be sleeping under a bridge. We need to get people inside. And if we can get them right into permanent housing, let's do that. If we need to expand low barrier shelter capacity to do that, if we need to master lease motels to do that, we're gonna take any approach that we can find to get people safely inside and on a path to permanent housing. And it's working. It's working in Dallas. It's beginning to work in places like Los Angeles, which has seen the worst crisis of unsheltered homelessness this nation knows. Something like 46,000 people experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles on a given night. And finally, for the first time in years, Los Angeles has begun to see reductions in homelessness, and reductions especially in unsheltered homelessness. And that's come through the leadership of a mayor who's fired up about this and focused on it, but who also comes out of substance abuse treatment backgrounds. Karen Bass in Los Angeles used to run a recovery program, and her approach to addressing encampments isn't let's round people up and arrest them and make them move along. It's let's get people the help they need. Let's get people into housing. Let's get people wraparound supports. That's how you end homelessness. How many of you tracked the Supreme Court's activity over the last year or so? They just made one bad decision after another, from my point of view. One of the most harmful decisions they made, among many, was the decision in the Grants Pass versus Johnson case, which opens the door for communities to harass, arrest, fine, jail people simply because they have no place to sleep. We as a nation have been down this road before. There are old laws like the 1880 Rhode Island Tramp Act that tried to do this. There were laws in Philadelphia in the 1820s that caused police to round up folks who didn't have a place to live and put them in jail. None of that solves homelessness. It doesn't work. And yet we're seeing community after community across this country try to arrest their way out of homelessness, think that they can throw a few $100s or a few $1,000s of fines on people, put them in jail, and expect that that's going to solve anything about our housing crisis, our mental health crisis, our addiction crisis. In fact, these approaches are expensive, they're ineffective, and they're inhumane. It just simply doesn't work. Just think about it. How are you going to take somebody who's been sleeping on the street? If they had the $295 to pay the fine, they'd probably be in a hotel room tonight, not on the street, or in their own apartment. Now you're going to make them move along to where? If there aren't enough shelter beds. You're going to give them a fine to pay with what when they don't have any income, and you're going to put them in jail and give them a record that makes it harder to get a job, harder to get a house, and cycling in and out of homelessness. It just simply doesn't work. We can do better. Our agency released some guidance on 19 strategies to humanely and effectively address encampments. If you've not taken a look at that, I encourage you to do that. We've also released guidance on how health systems can get more involved in homelessness response. And we were having a conversation over dinner last night about how the health systems in Maine can step up more. And we want to see that. We're pushing that around the country. We believe that this is an all-hands-on-deck response. It is not just the homeless service system who can solve homelessness. That would be like asking the emergency room at the hospital to solve depression and obesity and everything else, right? You all are often an emergency response system. You're where people come when they have no other options. Now, you're doing an extraordinary job helping people exit homelessness, but we need folks like the healthcare system to help prevent homelessness from happening in the first place. We need them to step up and help fund recuperative care programs, which I know is beginning to happen here in the state. We need them to fund street medicine teams to get out into communities and take care of people where they are. We're seeing some incredible bright spots around the country. I just painted a pretty dire picture, right? Sorry about that. Your eyes wide open. You're in this work every day. There's a lot to be hopeful about. We're seeing a doubling down on Housing First here in Maine, which is fantastic. Housing First is under attack in many parts of the country. I don't know if you're following this. Maybe it's not as bad here in Maine, but I know Grover and the team at the Housing Narrative Lab are focused on this. We see Housing First used as a political football, as a political weapon. And the logic goes something like this. Wow, the federal government's been pushing Housing First for 15 or 20 years, and we still have homelessness. That must be a policy failure. Wow, we've been investing in all this housing, and we still see all these encampments. It must not be working. It's flawed logic, by the way, right? It's bad public policy analysis. What's really happening is we're doing an extraordinary job moving people out of homelessness into housing, faster than we've ever done. We're not turning off the faucet. We're constantly bailing the bathtub. And so what the public sees is we've invested all this money and we still have homelessness. It must not be working. We should try something different, as opposed to saying, what we're doing is working at the individual level. We have not solved it at the societal level. Let's do both. It's a little bit like, I've been thinking about this lately. It's a little bit like kindergartners. There are a lot of little people in chairs in kindergarten now that school's back in session. What if next year the voters say, we funded kindergarten last year. We put all this money into kindergarten over the last 10 years, 20, 50 years, 100 years, and we still have kindergartners. It's not a perfect metaphor, by the way, but you got to scale up the stuff that works. You got to expand the stuff that's working. Now, it is true that Housing First doesn't work for everybody. And Housing First especially doesn't work if you don't do Housing First and still call it Housing First. We see this in some parts of the country because Housing First has taken on a good evidence base, a lot of support, that people say, yeah, we're doing Housing First, and you start unpacking it, and they're really not. They're putting up a lot of barriers for people, or they just aren't simply able to provide the wraparound supports. And so that doesn't work. You got to do it with really good, robust, assertive community treatment teams, access to health care and other supportive services. So you got to do it right. It sounds like you're doing a lot of that here in Maine. But we also know that at its best, Housing First works for 85 to 90% of folks, which is incredible, like really good results. It is the best intervention we have to address homelessness. But it also means it's not working for 10 to 15% of people. And we need to figure out other interventions that serve those folks. I am a firm believer in recovery housing, in sober living when people want that, in shared living situations that are more grounded in community and relationship. We need to try a bunch of stuff, not just think that we've got a silver bullet that'll solve everything. We're also seeing tremendous bright spots around prevention these days. I talked about the need to go upstream, the need to begin turning off those faucets. We're seeing really good work happen around youth and young adults, particularly those aging out of foster care, the vast majority of whom are youth of color and LGBTQ youth. We're seeing a really good focus on youth homelessness demonstration programs and HUD's YESI grants that improve youth systems. We're seeing the Department of Justice step up and fund reentry programs so that people exiting out of jails and prisons don't become homeless. We're seeing, coming out of the pandemic, communities use flexible funding pools to help people pay for a $300 car repair or pay back rent or stay stabilized where they are so they never even end up in the shelter. I know you all are beginning to move in that direction. I want to challenge you to move even more firmly in that direction. And it's not necessarily the same people, the same agencies, and the same funding streams when we start talking about prevention. We are not asking the continuum of care and its nonprofits to solve all of this. Again, that would be like asking emergency room nurses and doctors to solve primary care issues way upstream. We need both. We need a primary care system and an emergency room and a long-term care system. The long-term care you're doing is around housing and services. The emergency room is around shelter and outreach and keeping people alive. Now we've got to pair that with a really strong upstream prevention approach. That is the equation that's ultimately going to solve homelessness. Here in Maine, you are at a crossroads. You're clearly addressing a problem that's growing, that's incredibly challenging right now, that has increased in the years during and since the pandemic. And yet there is a lot to be hopeful about. You've got Dean Klein coming in as the executive director of the Maine Continuum of Care. I think that's an extraordinary opportunity. I don't want to underestimate how challenging that has been, because change is hard. And yet, what I know about what's happening here is that you're at a crossroads. You've got, from what I can tell, very good state leadership in the governor's office on this, the work Greg Payne's doing, the commitment of your governor. You've got a critical mass of people and energy and creativity that is witnessed by those of you in this room, the work that you do every day. You're at a real inflection point. And I want to encourage you, whether you're new in this work or whether you've been in it a long time, now is the time to recommit to working together, to deepening your collaboration, to expanding your decision-making tables so that people with lived experience are not tokenized, but who are deeply involved as collaborators, as sharers of power, as the real voice of what it will take to end homelessness. We need people with lived experience at every single table. We need our boards and our executive leadership in nonprofits to look like the people who you serve, to be represented by people you have served, and to be grounded in this commitment to lifting up the voice of people who have been there. I'm going to quote Swanee again, if that's okay. You talked about, because you can't leave your Boston-ness or your Massachusetts-ness behind too much, right? You talked about wicked high expectations. I have wicked high expectations for you all. I think the work you're already doing is tremendous. I've known Preble Street's work for a long time. I hear about the work that you all are doing across the state, and I know what you're doing is making a difference in the lives of individuals every single day. Think about it. Think about, in your time working on this issue, whatever your role is, the people that you have seen exit homelessness. Just think about it. Hold a person in your mind right now who used to be homeless and who is not now because of your work. We have seen countless success stories. People who had given up on themselves, people who society had given up on, people who it's very hard even on your best days to hold out hope that things are going to get better for them, and yet it does for so many people. The housing you're providing, the services that you provide, the pathways out of homelessness you provide are making an extraordinary difference every single day. We've got to continue working to scale that up to meet the need. We've got to continue working to go upstream to stop homelessness from happening in the first place. And we've got to continue every day to make some choices. Got to make a choice to keep showing up. As Michelle Obama said recently in a speech, do something. Got to keep showing up, and you all are. You're in this room now. You'll go back to your roles in your communities tomorrow and next week and the week after that. Got to keep showing up. Another choice we have to make is to take care of ourselves and to take care of each other. Self-care is very, very hard in this work. I get to travel the country a lot and meet with communities. I get to sit with lived experience advisory boards and youth action boards. I get to go out with outreach teams. I get to meet with mayors and governors and people who are directing state budgets and city budgets. It also means I'm on airplanes a lot. And there's this announcement they always make about the oxygen masks. You remember the oxygen mask part? What do they say? Did you say help the person next to you first? I think somebody said help. That's a social worker. Put your own oxygen mask on before helping others, right? Remember to take care of yourself. We need you in this work for a long time to come. Again, whether you're new to this work or whether you've been at it a while, burnout it's a risk of the job. It is really, really hard work that you're doing, particularly for those of you who are in direct service and particularly for those of you who have been homeless and you're in direct service. Make sure that you're getting the support, the supervision, the peer support that you need. Put on your own oxygen mask first. And then finally, we have a choice to make between hope and despair. It is really easy to get down in this work, to feel like you're banging your head against a brick wall because you're advocating for somebody to get into housing and there's no housing to be found, to feel like you're walking beside people as they get into detox for the 8th time and relapse again, as somebody who you've supported as they leave a violent partner, goes back to that violent partner. These are hard things. And yet, on the 9th time it works. On the 2nd time it works. On the 20th time it works. We have a choice. Do we choose to be overwhelmed by the darkness, by the heaviness, by the challenges stacked against us? Do we give in to despair? Or do we choose hope? I think hope's better. I think it's a better way to live. Hope is a discipline. It's something you do every day, not something you just like magically walk around in. You gotta keep going to the gym. You can't just say, "Oh, I went to the gym in January. It was great." You got to keep eating, right? You can't just say, "I had a really nice meal yesterday. I'm all good today." You got to keep cultivating hope. And finally, hope is a choice. It is a choice to believe that things could be better, not only for this individual, but for us as a nation, that we can do better. We can be a place where everyone has a place to go. Everyone has a safe home of their own. If those of us in this room can't imagine a future like that, nobody else is going to either. It is on us to choose hope every day, and it's on us to hold out hope for people until they have hope for themselves. Thank you so much for being here. It's really great to be with you all.
Thank you, Jeff. That was great. That was wicked inspiring. So we've got about 15 minutes or so for questions for Jeff, and there's a couple roving people with mics. I would just ask you if you could state your name and what organization you're with, if you're representing an organization. If you're a person of lived experience and you're comfortable saying that, please feel free to do so. And whatever you say, put it in the form of a question. We have other people here to make speeches, so please ask questions and Jeff will answer. Thank you. I'll be the timekeeper.
Okay, great.
Good morning. My name is Brian Hester. I'm a veteran that experienced homelessness, and I've been set on the path of success. My question for you, Jeff, is that, okay, so when I was found an apartment, they had resources to get me set for success. In other words, they provided transportation for me. They furnished my apartment. They made me feel worth something. So what can we as a community do for the average person that's homeless in resources like they did for me as a veteran?
Mr. Hester, thank you for such a good question, and thank you for your service to this nation. The work that has been done on veteran homelessness is the roadmap, it's the blueprint. And as a nation, we've been able to reduce veteran homelessness by more than half in the last 15 years. And the secret recipe is housing and good wraparound supports. When you talk about transportation and kind of reconnecting, we've done that, I think, better for veterans than we have for families, for older adults, for young people. And part of it's that the VA system exists. There's a better system of benefits. There's a better kind of more, it's basically a universal health system in a way that other groups may not have access to. But I think there's a lot we can learn from that. And in my mind, it is that combination of stable housing and good wraparound supports. Now, wraparound supports are going to look very different for a young person aging out of foster care than they might for an older single veteran. That young person might need reconnection to school, to getting into the workforce for the first time, to developing a network of friends and family if they have no family of their own. It might look very different for an elderly person who's homeless for the first time, who's maybe not a veteran, never been homeless. Their income stays like this, cost of housing goes like this, and they're homeless. They lose a spouse, they lose a job, a car, and they're homeless. So can we connect better on the aging services, on elder services, in a way that might not be needed for a young mom with kids? So I think it's about individualizing those supports. The challenge agencies have often is how do you pay for that? There aren't always funding streams like we have on the veteran side. We're trying at the federal level to use Medicaid in more creative ways to provide for wraparound supports and housing stability supports and things like that. But I think what we need to do is to mirror your experience with other folks who are not veterans. Thank you for asking that. We've got one here and one down here. Yeah.
So Bill Higgins, Homeless Advocacy for All, 4-time homeless veteran. What can we do to prioritize diversion, putting the money into the system to prevent homelessness and make it happen? And then utilizing the successes of that to get more funding to help stop the stream of coming in, help abolish poverty, work on giving people as many resources as they can possibly qualify for. Veterans that were denied benefits years ago are now eligible to reapply and get the support that they need. And there's a lot of homeless veterans out there that have been messed over for years. And we need to work on those streams to slow the incoming people. Let's see, what can we do to make that happen?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for your service as well. Really appreciate your question around diversion. Diversion, in my mind, is part of a larger prevention strategy. Diversion often happens when people are in real crisis and they call up the shelter, the continuum of care, asking for help. And they're like, I'm out tomorrow, or I'm going to lose my place in a week. We need to intervene there, and I think we've had good success doing that with rapid rehousing and other approaches. In some ways, that's too late. You also want to help people stabilize before they're to that level of crisis. And we learned a lot during the pandemic on what kind of interventions can do that, and I'll talk about two. One is the expansion of the child tax credit. Now, you may not directly link that to homelessness, but we dramatically expanded the child tax credit during the pandemic. And what that did was lift a lot of families, a lot of households out of poverty, and in particular families of color, and stabilized them in housing. It gave them money in their pocket to pay the rent, to pay car repair, to put food on the table. The other thing that we were able to do, and this was with bipartisan support, we were able to put massive amounts of money into eviction prevention dollars. This was the Treasury Department's Emergency Rental Assistance Fund that came in the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan. It really worked. 4 years ago, many of us, including probably many of you in this room, when COVID really exploded on the landscape, many of us were predicting a tsunami of new homelessness. We saw people losing their jobs. We saw just this incredible economic upheaval, and it didn't happen. Not like we thought. I mean, homelessness has increased the last couple of years, but we thought it was going to be like the Great Depression all of a sudden, where we had millions of people out on the street, living in parks, and we're seeing it. I'm not saying it's not there, but we did not see it on the scale that we expected. And in fact, from 2020 to 2022, homelessness remained flat in this country. Then what happened is Congress didn't fund the stuff we were asking for. We were asking for $150 billion in Build Back Better around housing and homelessness. We've asked for expansion of the child tax credit. Congress has said no. We've asked for guaranteed vouchers for low-income veterans to finish the work of ending veteran homelessness, and for transition-age youth as a guaranteed voucher. Congress has said no. We've asked for expansion of the emergency rental assistance program that we know worked to stabilize people upstream, and we've not been able to get the congressional support to do those things that we know work. What we need from you all is to talk about that. Talk about it with the media. Talk about it with your congressional delegation. You've got some really good folks in Washington representing you all. Let them know that these prevention efforts work. Let them know that we need to fund it.
Hi, I'm Shay Dufour. I'm a person with lived experience on the board of directors for Church of Safe Injection, recovery coach, and advocate. Throughout the years that I've been doing advocacy in Portland, now that Johnson versus Grants Pass has not gone the way we wanted it to, I have seen an abundance of people that are unhoused and that I call my family lose a lot of their self-worth, their items, and overall just be disrespected, degraded, in a way that's just not okay. I want to know what the plan is to get the community involved with the police task force, with this Maine State Police, to just our whole government in general, on how they can approach our unhoused folks and not, violate them in a way where they feel that they can't trust anybody. I was just explaining to my colleague Jen that a lot of these folks have no trust left in either, in us too. And we're the ones that are supporting them. What can we do to bring the police together with the community and with people with lived experience and people that are unhoused to start doing that barrier of not throwing their items away, doing a program where, unfortunately you can't sleep here, but let's find you another solution. Let's find you a place to put your stuff. Let's make sure we don't cause any more PTSD or trauma in anybody that's unhoused, because let's face it, they have a problem with PTSD and trauma to begin with. So what can we do? What are we gonna work on with that?
It's a great question. Yeah, I'll give you that. And thank you for your work too, for turning your lived experience into a powerful tool to support others. I'm a huge fan of the recovery coaching model, and that's excellent work. I think you can do a couple things. One is, I mentioned the guidance we put out around encampments. It talks about storage of belongings and not throwing people's stuff away. So you could point to that and say, Jeff said this. I don't know if it'll carry any weight, but it's a federal guidance document around best practices. The other thing that I've seen work is really engaging with law enforcement in conversation, getting people with lived experience talking with leadership at law enforcement agencies, but also frontline officers, just to really problem solve around this. Because my experience, there are obviously some bad cops who just want to be mean. Most don't. Most don't want to be feeling like they have to solve homelessness. That's not why they got into law enforcement. It's not, so if you talk with people, often there's a way to humanize one another. I'm not saying some law enforcement doesn't behave really badly. They certainly do. Then I think you hit the leadership, both, if it's a sheriff or a police chief or a mayor who has some oversight over a police department, and engage them on, don't criminalize, don't mistreat people. These folks are traumatized, you're making it worse, you're escalating situations that don't need to be escalated, and stop throwing people's stuff away. That's obnoxious. And I think telling stories, I heard a story recently about someone whose child's ashes were thrown away in an encampment sweep. Come on. We're talking about human beings with one another. People need IDs, they need medication, they need belongings that keep them connected to their past, to their future, to their family, photographs, documentation, all of it. And so I think humanizing those stories from an advocacy point of view is really important. And again, maybe we can talk about that a little bit later with some of the narrative work, but I think humanizing the issue, but engaging law enforcement directly in this, in conversation, I think is important.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Harkins. I am an advocate with lived experience with Homeless Voices for Justice. I'm also on Statewide Homeless Council, the Board of Chom Housing, and the COC.
You do a lot.
I do, and then I volunteer. I'm boots on the ground, and I see, like Shay said, a lot of things going on. I literally watched a lady get a ticket while we were coming out of our meetings, and I just kind of stood there and watched. The officer started off like he was going to give her a jaywalking ticket. So out of curiosity, I walked across the street in the same part twice. He changed it over to loitering. And then as he was writing the ticket, he was telling the lady that it was a hot day, and she had her T-shirt, because she didn't have anything else around, and she had it just wound up a little bit so she could get some air on her stomach. She was told that anybody that would dress like that was obviously out working, and he would be watching her and be arresting her. Wow. The same person won't let people even sit. In our parking lot the other day, he was telling a man, this man couldn't sit on the corner right at the end of our driveway in our parking lot. He said, you have to go back to Elena's Way. And I just kind of interfered, walked up and asked him if the can on the ground next to him was his. And he said, no. And I said, well, that's good, because I'd have to ticket you. And the man just kind of looked at me because he was giving him a hard time. I winked, and it's like, bye. But this is how people are being treated. We still don't have any warming center in sight. Portland talks about it. They do nothing. There's a lot of NIMBYism. And this is the largest city in the state and should be ashamed of itself because it's not doing better. People need to work together. Is there any way, you got any suggestions? Because it doesn't always work.
Yeah.
With
Yeah, I mean, I think around the law, thank you for all of that, and it's horrifying what you just described. I think if there is a police department that has a policy around this, that's pushing officers to do that, either written or implied, challenge the policy. Again, try to go as high up as you can to challenge that and talk about how inhumane it is, how out of alignment it is with Portland values or Maine values. You may not be able to fix that. If it's an individual officer behaving badly, go after him. Write him up, file complaints. That stuff makes an impact, so do that. You also talked about something else, though, and that's that people don't have a safe place to go. A warming center, you don't have enough shelter beds, I understand. Like a few years ago, the shelter beds kind of matched the need a little bit more, and now the need has gotten greater. I think working with the state, the cities, philanthropy, health systems, to scale up the number of available beds, safe places to be. Most people don't want to be outside in public view and, in the way of law enforcement. Most people do want a safe place to be. Not all. There are some people who, because of mental health reasons or substance use, have a hard time going inside. Scale up your outreach teams to really connect with them and build a relationship, and over time that really does work. But I think it's a multi-pronged strategy. There's a, how do you address police mistreatment of people? That's sort of an advocacy issue and a training issue. How do you address the need for safe places for people to go? And then how do you do a kind of scaled up outreach to meet the needs of people who aren't coming inside? There's not an easy answer to this. And you're not alone. I mean, this is a trend we're seeing around the country.
Hi, my name is Dr. Katie Spencer-White. I'm the CEO at Mid-Maine Homeless Shelter and Services in Waterville. You mentioned the 84,000 units of affordable housing that Maine is missing. One of the things that is notable about this is it's not just happening in Maine. 60% of all global assets are in real estate. 75% of those are held in the United States, and that represents annually more than 2 times global GDP. Real estate has become an increasingly attractive investment for real estate investors, but they are profiteering. 50 years ago when we had a surplus, they wanted 6% ROI. Today they want 18%. So my question to you as a federal bureaucrat is, how is the Biden-Harris administration tackling this dearth of housing, in particular for small rural states like Maine? And I'm manifesting here, but what direction will a President Harris take us for the next 4 years?
I can speak with some authority on your first question. On the second one, I do not represent the Harris campaign nor the future administration. One thing that we've done is we put out a White House housing supply action plan a year and a half or so ago that tries to put the nation on track to develop 3 million units of affordable housing. Or 3 million units of housing, with some of that really targeting deeply affordable. Some of that includes more creative financing. Some of it has been legislative, where we're trying to expand low-income housing tax credits. Again, we've had challenges in Congress on that, although I'm actually holding out some hope on bipartisanship around housing. It has bubbled up to be one of the top campaign issues across the board, nationally and state and local elections. So I'm hopeful we can find some common ground on things like expanding low-income housing tax credit further. Some of it's incentivizing localities to do better with zoning. So much around housing development is governed at the local level, not the federal level, but the federal government's looking at ways to try to incentivize communities to do more multifamily zoning, more inclusionary zoning, and doing things to try to speed along the development pipeline, because sometimes it just takes too long to develop housing. Around the profiteering side of this, one trend that we're seeing is very large corporations buying up a lot of smaller landlord properties and then evicting people en masse. The White House published a blueprint for a renter's bill of rights. Again, the federal government doesn't have a lot of authority to say, here are the protections for renters, because this is a lot of private market stuff, but we're encouraging states and localities to use this blueprint to pass laws at the local and state level that really do put some teeth into renter bills of rights around kind of just trying to shore up eviction prevention. So we're doing what we can. It's not enough and it's not perfect. Again, the work that was done in the early days of Build Back Better, which would become the Infrastructure Act, had a lot on this issue around housing supply, and it simply got left on the cutting room floor. Now, you have a bipartisan delegation to D.C. Talk to them and say, revive some of those things, because it's been written, and it just needs to be brought back up and passed. And man, you got data in your head. That's impressive.
Time for one more question, I think?
I think one more question is what we have time for. Do it back here.
Okay. Hi, my name is Sasha Anastasoff. I'm here with the City of Auburn, and I also run the homeless education program for the Auburn School Department. I often hear, build it and they will come. And so I think that is one of the concerns that I often hear, not just in our community, but statewide, with if you provide these services, then you're gonna have an influx of people coming in, whether it's to your city or to your state. With your experience, how do you combat that frame of mind and that thought process of build it and they will come, and instead focus more on how we help individuals in our communities and in our states and ease that fear of not in my backyard, not in my front yard, not here, let it be taken care of somewhere else?
Yeah, I think you combat that with stories and with data. It's usually not true for the most part. That if you really look at who's homeless in a community nationally, it usually shakes out to about 85% of people became homeless in the community that they are homeless. They were housed there before. There are some exceptions to that. A city like Portland attracts people from all over the state, right? People move here. They move here when they're done with high school. They move here when they're done with college. They move here when they're sick of Boston or New York or whatever, right? People come. So there are some exceptions around kind of the more urban hubs. And then another exception is that when you're in a period of growth, which I think Maine is, and you've got an influx of newly arrived folks from other countries coming and seeking asylum, seeking a new life. Some of those numbers might look different now. I would guess particularly in Portland, but I don't know that for sure. I think in places around the state, Auburn, elsewhere, run the numbers. Like, look at the kids in your school and see, if you can, what their last known zip code was. I mean, HMIS should be collecting that. Just run a report on HMIS and see among the folks you're serving what the last known zip code was. More often than not, it is in the place that they were living before. And so shoring up the data, getting your own head clear on what the numbers really are, and then having people tell stories. I am from here. I'm born and raised in Auburn, and I became homeless here, and now I'm housed. And I think kind of the combination of storytelling and data is good. What's crazy to me is everybody around the country says that, and it can't be true, right? If everybody's saying, the other thing they say, I've not heard any Mainers say this, they say folks come here for the weather. That's what they say. I used to work in Albuquerque, and they would say, people come here for the weather. I'm like, have you slept outside in February in Albuquerque? It's, or Los Angeles says that. And then Los Angeles runs a report, and it turns out 85% of the people who are homeless in Los Angeles became homeless in Los Angeles. They didn't come there from elsewhere. The other group that's an exception on sometimes is runaway youth. There is, I think, more transience. You see that in Harvard Square in Cambridge and in New Orleans and San Francisco. So there's some exceptions, but I think I'd look at the numbers, find stories to tell, work with advocacy groups to hold those up. It's a great question, and thank you for your work in education, too. The Department of Ed is one of our member agencies, and the McKinney-Vento folks around the country do amazing work, so thank you for that. Thank you for the great questions. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeff, very much. And you're going to see more of Jeff in a few minutes. We're going to take a 15-minute break, get some coffee, say hi to some friends, come back into this room, and Jeff will be facilitating a conversation with our experts and colleagues from other parts of the country. So come back in 15. Thanks.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Let me just say a couple words about the format for the next few minutes, and then we'll dive into the panel. You all have some extraordinary national experts up here on the stage, and I am really honored to be able to enter into conversation with these extraordinary colleagues. The way this is going to work is that I'm going to have each of the speakers just briefly introduce themselves and say just a couple of minutes about the work they're doing, about some of the strategies that they've got going, and then we'll just get into some conversation about it, about how innovative interventions have come about, how good partnerships across the community are working, maybe some of the challenges that you all are seeing and how you've addressed those. But we'll just basically kind of get into some conversation with each other for the next little while. I've got a bunch of questions for them. I'll be tracking the clock, and if we do have some time toward the end, we'll open it up to the group. So if there are questions that you all have for these folks, feel free to ask them. If we end up not having a lot of time for that, they're going to be around, I think, most of you all for the day. Some are speaking at other breakout sessions, so you'll have time to connect with them and learn more about what they've got going on in their communities and nationally. So we'll just dive in, and Noah, why don't you get us going?
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Well, thank you for the invitation here to come to Maine today. Honored to be here with you all. My name is Noah Fay. I'm the Senior Housing Director at DESC in Seattle. We are an organization that serves single adults experiencing chronic homelessness, living with serious and profound disabling conditions. Our priority and origin story, actually very similar to the story Mark shared earlier, was working with a really high needs group of people for whom larger systems basically weren't working intentionally or otherwise including running shelter and outreach programs. And we got into the permanent supportive housing game, the housing game, I should say. That term didn't exist at the time, because we had a whole number of people who, back in the day in the city of Seattle, it was actually financially, mathematically possible to have a place to live. Those days are long gone, but we had no landlords who were willing to work with our clients, or if they were, we were struggling to help people successfully stay housed. So we got into the housing game ourselves. Since then, we've grown. We are most well known for our Housing First permanent supportive housing programming, which is, I think, the reason for my invitation here today. We are really lucky and fortunate to live in a community where there has been fairly deep investment in site-based permanent supportive housing first programming. DSC operates 17 site-based programs, 1,600 units, and growing. That's the good news. The bad news is, to Jeff's comment earlier, this work is harder now than ever before. I also did street outreach and direct service, so that's my effort at street cred for y'all. Love that work, and definitely reflect on it is much harder for those groups doing that work now than it was when I was doing it an earlier part of my career. And some of what we're seeing in our community that I'm happy to talk about more today are several kind of buckets of challenges in no particular order. I would say the kind of political environment in Seattle, which is a fairly historically liberal progressive place, is shifting, and there's a bit of a revolt on the housing first movement. This idea of low barrier housing first approaches is not as well entrenched as it was just 10 years ago. And so some of the arguments are what is old is new again around that we should be forcing people into treatment. This is not a housing issue. This is a drug use issue. And so we're finding lots of challenges to the housing first movement in a way we simply weren't a few years ago. We, of course, are always trying to find a way to sustain and invest in our workforce. That is really hard to do. We've made some really promising strides in that front. So wanting to talk about how we can sustain the people doing the work. We're only as strong as the people who are providing the direct service to our clients, and that's historically, as we've talked about already, not always easy to sustain. And then lastly, just the needs of the people we're serving are more complex, I think it's fair to say, than they were earlier in my career. I've been doing this for 20 years, lucky to say. And it's a lot harder now in that we are living with an overdose crisis in the city of Seattle, and I know all parts of the country. We have a crisis system that is kind of falling apart around us, so people who need more intensive services don't have access to what they used to. And then lastly, since we've been doing this for so long, we have to figure out how do we sustain these units over time. That's not easy to do financially and operationally, and we're trying to think with our partners and internally on how best we can do that. So look forward to talking about those things and others with you all today.
Thank you, Noah. Sorry. Turned off my mic so I wouldn't make noise. Thank you, Noah. And if those of you out there aren't familiar with DESC, they are a real leader on housing first. And as you heard in Noah's comments, they've been at it for decades and have really charted the way for a lot of us. What you're hearing also is some cautionary tales about how there can be backlash, about how financial sustainability becomes difficult. So I know Maine has been at this work for a long time also, but I believe there's a lot to be learned here as well. We've got Joel Givens here from the beautiful city of Rockford, Illinois.
Yes, sir.
And they have done extraordinary work around chronic and veteran homelessness over the years as part of the Built for Zero work. And you guys are rock stars.
Well, I don't know about that, but we're trying.
And you had a women's baseball team a long time ago.
We sure did, the Rockford Peaches.
That's right, yeah.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for allowing me to be here today. I am Joel Givens from Rockford, Illinois, right outside of Chicago. Now, I will start by telling you this. I am an infant when it comes to this type of work. And why I will tell you that because I got brought into this work in probably around 2021 by Angie Walker over there, the homeless program coordinator or manager for Rockford. And I was a district commander for Rockford Police Department. And then I retired in 2022. But before that, I was going out for outreach and everything like that. And I saw there was an issue there. Me being a veteran, also, I retired from the Air Force too. I saw veterans out on the street, and it troubled me tremendously. And then I did outreach. And how Angie got me to do outreach, she had a meeting at my district, and she invited me to come. And I said, okay. And then we started talking about this outreach thing. And I said, well, what is this outreach? What is this outreach? And so they took me on outreach. I was in full uniform. Shannon, she works for the fire department. She's also on outreach. And they got me in the back of the car and they said, here, you're going to do this tonight. And they had Dunkin' Donuts in the back of the car for me to pass out to everybody. So that's how I got the outreach. And then we started to go to different locations. I started to see that they were going into woods and into buildings I was like, wait a minute. I said, as a police officer, we were clearing these areas, not just walking into these areas, you know. And I saw the need for officers to have a better understanding in my district and throughout the police department. When we were talking about the arrest of officers, that was, I mean, of the homeless people, it was troubling to me because I have seen it happen. Officers are sometimes put in situations where they have to move someone along, and if they're not wanting to move along, then we have to do something, all right? Well, what Angie's program has done for our officers in Rockford, it has allowed us to be able to have someone to call on, to be able to have a resource readily available. When I was brought on for this position here, Bill Fazero said, hey, we're kind of interested in starting this landlord type position in Rockford. And little did I know, I'm a fisherman, and they were throwing lures out there. I wasn't catching on to the but I bit, And so October of 2023, basically, I started this voyage. Now, I wrote notes here down, but I really don't have to write the notes because I actually developed the program. I started with the name. I had to get something that was kind of catchy and I could remember, all right? I found out quickly in your line of work, acronyms, oh my God. Military and the police have nothing on you, all right? So I said, GYH, get your house. Say it with me, GYH. It runs off your tongue pretty smooth, right? So that's where we started the committee. We started the committee that way and with the name, and then we sent out invitations to all of these individuals through all of Rockford that deal with housing. I was fearful that people were going to be territorial about sharing their properties, but I brought donuts, refreshments. I warmed up to them. I said, I came in here and said, hey, look, I'm not the professional here. You are. I want to support you. I want to be able to create a program that's going to create issues that make it easier for your case managers, make it easier for the landlords, and so we had the landlord engagement specialists start right there. I brought all the communities, actually the agencies together, and we started talking about resource mapping. What can we do to help you? What can I do to help you? They were willing to share. I would say, okay, let's back up. They weren't willing to share right off the top, all right? There were silos there. But then I said, hey, look, we're all on the same mission here. We're trying to get people housed. I don't care who gets them housed. Let's just get them housed. So they start sharing all their information. What that developed, it started a listing that I put together that for housing it started out with 0, now we got 543 properties available for all the agencies to pull from. Okay, that's the first thing. Then I wanted to see, what did the landlords have to say? So we did a landlord survey. I thought that it would start out that money would be the issue. It wasn't. Follow-up. They needed follow-up. So what did we do? We said, okay, we're going to do a one-stop shopping. We're going to make it to where you have a telephone line and you have a hotline, or email that you can email in, and the landlord engagement specialist disseminates all the information to the agencies. So that takes care of the landlords there. We also started to meet with each of the landlords and explain the programs and the policies and everything to them, so they had a better understanding. At first, I started emailing people, and then I wasn't getting any responses. So I said, we're going to get out there and we're going to beat the street. All right. I was a cop, so I was used to walking the beat, so that wasn't nothing new. I did have to get a new pair of shoes though, because Angie has me working hard for the city of Rockford. So we went out there and we met with landlords, and we got, in that first-hand meeting, we were able to establish that relationship and actually sell. You got to sell it, all right? Even though they want to make that money and whatnot, okay, you got to sell it to them. Say, hey, look, we have intensive case management. We have follow-up. I do follow-up with them. I became an inspector of the properties. That was one of the issues that we found out that was an issue. Okay, the delay in, you have someone ready to move in, but the delay in them having to be able to have it inspected. I became an inspector. We were talking about me becoming a realtor, too. But nonetheless, our program, we saw there was an issue of concern. I was scared to death, all right, to actually take this on. But thus far, I've had the full support of Rockford, and I'll be willing to answer any questions. I had an advantage because I was already a police officer. I had an advantage that you may not have. I can show you how to get into those police agencies if you're not able to.
I appreciate you talking about all of that, the landlord engagement work you're doing now, but also the policing work that you've done. And I wonder in a little while if we can come back to some of the questions that were asked earlier
Yes.
around these interactions, because I think it's really tough all the way around. And you're right about all the acronyms. And on behalf of the entire federal government, I'd like to apologize to all of you. But the military, you guys came up with snafu?
Yes.
You came up with FUBAR? Like, you win on the
Yeah,
cool.
yeah.
Look them up.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm not going to say them here, but look them up. Kelly Kinghorn's going to take it next about the extraordinary work that she's leading in Richmond, Virginia. Kelly, I'm glad you're here. Take it away.
Thank you. Is my mic's on? All right. Well, good morning, y'all. My name is Kelly Kinghorn, and I'm the Executive Director of Homeward, and we are the lead agency for the Greater Richmond Continuum of Care. I have been with Homeward for 21 years, and our Continuum of Care has been working together doing really difficult work for 26 years. I'm going to give you all a quick history lesson because I'm not the only Southerner, but just we overly love our history. So our region is similar in size to the population of the state of Maine. 1.3 million in our metro area. And when the work began in my community, we really relied on some people who were just collaborative naturally, right? Like all communities, there's a group of friendly people, and we started working. And then we started to get more serious about talking to people with lived experience of homelessness, and really developed an expertise in person-centered data. We took HMIS seriously from the beginning, and it didn't work for a long time, garbage in, garbage out, so we focused on that, and we have really developed this sort of bench strength in understanding, talking to, listening to, and understanding what we hear from people experiencing homelessness. And then, so we have reliable, consistent data that, helps us understand what's working, where are the gaps. And, we also got that similar input from the service providers doing the work, many of whom, staff of homeless service agencies are often people with lived experience themselves. And so just that robust approach of listening, and then taking that, and with the passage of the Hearth Act in 2009, we really worked to formalize our governance. And it sounds really boring, and I think Mark mentioned earlier, you don't want to over-process. Well, we really talk about, committee meetings to change the world, that we don't meet to meet, but it's, using, every meeting starts with data, some input from our community, and then has an objective to make an impact, to move the needle. And so we worked hard to build our collaborative infrastructure, so we weren't relying just on personalities, but really, you have to make hard decisions together. You have to move money. You have to give performance feedback. And so, really focusing on how we did that together, because, this work is hard now, and there have been different challenges throughout our time together, and the challenges today, there will be challenges next year. And so we bring together in our continuum of care, homeless service providers, our local governments, other systems of care, persons with lived experience of homelessness, and private funders, all in meetings together. We have a funding, ranking, and review committee that matches the public funding with the private funding, so that we really have a holistic view of what's happening in homelessness and how do we connect to other systems. And then, we paired all of that with a capacity building program. So at Homeward, my agency, we do a best practices conference every year, started in 2007. We have just around 200 people at our conference. So, this room, it feels familiar in that way. And it was at that conference where we started talking about rapid rehousing, for example, in 2007. Then at Homeward, we raised some private money to pilot this. And then within a few years, our transitional housing providers voluntarily reallocated their funding to rapid rehousing, because they knew they could serve more people at the same or less cost, and that it wasn't about them. Prior to that, well, people need me. Well, this is not about you, right? So that was, a hard conversation that people got to naturally through these, community processes and in conversation. We have been a housing-focused system for quite a long time. We really started in '09. We engage agencies serving survivors fleeing domestic violence. We've picked up our youth and young adult work recently. We have some new federal funding, which is really making a difference. We knew we needed to expand the pie and not fight over crumbs. And then, I think emergency shelters remain a challenge. Our shelter providers are amazing. They are housing focused, and they have the least sort of dedicated funding and the least support. So that's something as a community we really have tried to tackle. So our shelters are coordinated. We use coordinated entry even for our shelters. We have bi-weekly case conferencing where we come together, like looking at people by name and how do we collectively house people, connect to other services. We have used diversion funding or flexible funding, mostly private, to really help someone get out of shelter so they're not waiting for a housing intervention. We also use that with people on the streets. In Virginia, we're a Medicaid expansion state. That took a while to get there, and that's been another game changer. Of now we do, the data sharing was hard, but we do case conferencing with our Medicaid partners because they can provide some of those supportive services that we can't, that we don't fund. And we've noticed that the people in shelters are more like our unsheltered population. It used to be quite different, and now it's very similar. And so that's when we're addressing unsheltered homelessness, we're including the shelter partners as part of that response. And I'll just end my comments by saying, I heard a HUD official once say that continuum of care governance is sort of what makes everything hang together, and that has certainly been true for us. We absolutely do better work together. We know we can do difficult things, and it's really by thinking about how we make decisions that has really helped us do that. So thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. We thought about naming this panel Making COC Governance Sexy Again, but we decided it was bigger than just that. So, our next panelist is Hannah Sims, and you heard me reference some of the good work in Dallas, Texas, over the last year or two. Dallas is one of the 7 jurisdictions that's part of our All Inside initiative, which is an unsheltered initiative we launched with the White House. Seattle is also one of those communities. And Dallas, in large part because of the leadership of Hannah's organization, has begun to see real decreases in unsheltered homelessness, especially. They've done very good work on veteran homelessness and on other things. I just think the work they're doing is smart and thoughtful and focused. So, Hannah, all yours.
Thanks, Jeff. Hi, everybody. My name is Hannah Sims, and I am the Crisis System Manager at Housing Forward, and we're the lead agency for Dallas and Collin County. So Kelly's right. I'll probably say y'all a lot. I'm not the only Southerner up here.
Right.
So as my role in Crisis System Manager, I really oversee our 2 primary tools to resolving unsheltered homelessness, our Coordinated Outreach Initiative, as well as our Street to Home encampment response. But I think it's helpful to talk about what the system kind of used to look like. I come to this work with the lens of being a former outreach worker. I quickly fell in love with the population of folks that were experiencing unsheltered homelessness. But when I was an outreach worker back in 2017, 2018, it was a constant frustration as an outreach worker to have a caseload of 25 to 30 folks that were living outside. And what I would essentially do is pitch them the idea of, look, if you work with me as your outreach worker and we keep in touch for a year, we can try to get you housed. And to borrow the verbiage from our friends earlier, that's a pretty shitty offer to give people, to say, stick with me for a year, continue to live where you're living, continue to experience the trauma of unsheltered homelessness, and then we'll see what happens. And also as an outreach worker, the only tools we really had available were allow encampments to stay. The city would come through and they would get cleared and people would disperse, and my job as an outreach worker got even harder. I felt like I was herding cats in the middle of a dumpster fire in the eye of a hurricane. If anyone works in outreach services, you might relate to what that feels like. Or we could just try to arrest our way out of the problem, none of which actually solved it. None of them were effective. So around 2021, our system started going through a pretty large-scale system transformation. And at the same time, the lead agency was also going through a pretty large-scale transformation as well. So at that time, I moved over and started with Housing Forward. And since then, we have developed some pretty strategic and innovative tools to actually resolving unsheltered homelessness. I'll talk about those later in the workshop, but our primary tool is a coordinated outreach model, so aligning staffing, resources, funding to cover 100% of our COC's geography, as well as our street-to-home encampment response, which is intentionally housing the folks that live at a specific site, working with our city partners to come through and effectively close and decommission that site and do not allow anyone to reestablish residency at that site. I'm pretty allergic to the idea of people being service resistant. I think people are resistant to services that don't work, and I think it's our job as a system to make those services work for the people and the unique needs of folks that are unsheltered. I'll talk about that later as well, but I just don't buy into the fact that people are resistant to services, resistant to housing. We are a housing first community. I don't think you have to go into any sort of transitional housing. We have seen a lot of success from housing people directly from the street into permanent housing. And since that system transformation in 2021, our PIT count results this year were 24% reduction in chronic unsheltered homelessness. Much of that is really a result of being highly collaborative, working with public and private partners. Our continuum of care is made up of, I think, 152 public and private organizations, lots of cities within our geography as well. So I'm excited to continue to share all of that with y'all.
Thank you. Thanks for being here, Hannah. You talked about what was it? Doing what in a dumpster fire?
Oh, it's herding cats
Herding
in a dumpster
cats
fire.
in a dumpster fire in the middle of a hurricane.
Yeah, exactly. That's just a normal
Can I
day.
quote you on that and just keep using it?
Yes.
Around the country?
That's a
28 years ago next month, I started a new job at a place called St. Martin's Hospitality Center in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It was sort of a warming center, overnight drop-in center. And I pulled around the corner my first night on the job. I was working the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift, and the dumpster out front was on fire. It was literally a dumpster fire, my first day on the job. The image stays. Our final panelist, Grover, we're really excited to hear from you. Grover Wayman Brown is with the Housing Narrative Lab, and you've got an extensive history in communications broadly and all sorts of really great racial justice work. Housing Narrative Lab has come onto the national scene in the last couple of years, just doing extraordinary work, helping our movement rethink how we talk about it, how we talk about the work we're doing, how we tell a different story. And so I'm really glad you're here.
Thanks, Jeff. Hi, everyone. As Jeff said, my name is Grover, and I am the narrative specialist for the Housing Narrative Lab. And to start off, I just want to share a story about how I came into this work. About 22 years ago, I was a young trans person in New York City who had left the rural community I was raised in to go to New York City and find my people and be able to live what I really was psyched about, my best life. And what I found there was a great community and a really vibrant place to grow into adulthood. And also I found that working service worker job couldn't pay my rent when I scratched my cornea and missed work and got fired, and when our landlord didn't fix our heat in January and my roommates decided to move and I didn't have $800 for the next place. And just those two small experiences launched me into a 4-year period of homelessness and housing insecurity. And when I was finally stable, I had to move to multiple different cities that were more affordable. I moved to the South, to Durham, North Carolina, back when it was more affordable, and finally had my own apartment for myself for the first time. That was a very powerful experience, to close my door, to paint my walls, to take my free Craigslist couch and put it in my living room and lay on it and think. And what I did in that moment was then start to really think about what the hell happened that I, a person who was raised in the same house from 0 to 18 with union worker parents, who's white, right, who was in college, that I had that experience. And I saw when I was there what other people were living through, mostly folks of color, a lot of elderly people, and there was no services for trans young people. The Ali Forney Center started the second year I was experiencing homelessness, and it was targeted at queer youth of color as it should have been. And in trying to make sense of what happened, it opened up these bigger questions. What is happening in our nation that we accept homelessness on the scale that I saw in 2002 and 3 and 4, which now is even significantly more. And then I spent the next 10 years doing research, getting into community organizing and advocacy, and really talking to people, doing research. I did research in rural Northern California, going into communities where I would talk to people who were living in the woods and who were living in their cars and parking lots. And then I would go talk to business owners and community leaders and say, what do you think about homelessness in your town? And they say, we don't have homelessness here. So what is it that allows that to be possible? And I imagine that here in Maine, you experience similar kinds of dissonance between what you see and know and what the community conversation is. And so now I'm at the Housing Narrative Lab, and our work is to big picture try to change the logic, the national conversation, what's widely accepted about homelessness in our country. This is big tent work that requires each and every one of you in this room, a majority of people in each of the towns and communities that you work in, to really reckon with and change the way that we think about the causes and available solutions to homelessness. So that's the work that we do. And specifically, I want to share with you that Jeff, bang up speech, by the way. I was like, that was a good speech. And I know a lot about speeches. Jeff mentioned the recent Johnson versus Grants Pass decision at the Supreme Court. And at the Housing Narrative Lab, when that court case was on the horizon, we knew that we had to focus our attention on it, and really we had been tracking it before, because what was happening nationwide is that there was a well-coordinated, intentional strategy by who I think of as my opposition to turn back housing first, both legislatively and narratively. So they had a legislative campaign and they had a narrative campaign. And what we're living through now is the end result of people who sat in a room, who made a decision, who executed a strategy that was well-funded. And so my question to us is, are we thinking big picture? I know some of you work in shelters. You do really direct, really micro work. But how are we all part of a big picture decision and strategy that we're going to solve homelessness in my lifetime? And what are we going to do to get there? And are we going to invest the resources to do it? And how are we going to have the discipline together, not to say the exact same words? Here I provide you with opportunities to say some excellent words that are researched, and I encourage you to use them if they work for your community, but not to say the exact same words, but to hold the same vibes, the same shared vision, and bring more and more people into the room and into that vision that aren't with you yet, so that we actually can have the public support and the public will to do so.
Excellent.
So I want to share with you that when the Supreme Court was taking up the Johnson versus Grants Pass case, we worked with the National Homelessness Law Center, who was leading the legal strategy on that case, to say, okay, we're going to need a big, we're going to need to have a big comms campaign to try to fight this before, and then we're going to have a big comms campaign afterwards to try to get communities to not do it if it passes, and to win forward if we win, right? Like, how are we going to win if they were able to defeat Johnson versus Grants Pass? How do we stop this anti-housing first movement that's taken hold across the country? And so we worked with Lake Research Partners to poll thousands of adults across the nation about what they think about clearing people's homes, people's tents off the sidewalk, right? And ticketing and arresting people because they have nowhere else to go. And the outcome is that the vast majority of people actually understand that that's not going to work, that it's mean, and that it's a distraction. They understand that, and what our research found was that people are like really done. They're like fed up, they're upset, they don't want to see it. And what our research also found that was interesting is that actually the majority of people either themselves have experience with homelessness or housing insecurity or know someone who does. So there are both challenges and opportunities in what we found in that research. And we created a message guide. And here, the dean and his team allowed us to publish this in the program, so thank you for that. And here is a summary of just top line our research findings, and also there's this little speckled box here that's called a QR code. And if you have a phone with a camera on it, you can, usually I just tap down and type in the word scan and pull up a scanner that when you hold it over this, it will open the website that has our messaging guide. So I encourage you to take a look at it some other time, not while we're talking. And also we have other resources that get to other sticky aspects of really solving homelessness and building the public will to do so, including we created a message guide about that issue that Jeff referred to of there's people who are coming to our country to be safe, to find opportunity, like so many of us have had, and they have no place to live. They're living in parks. And what's happening is that people who have been living on the street for a long time and the people who serve them are so frustrated that instead of saying, okay, we got more of us, we got more work to do, it's pitting communities against each other. And that's not gonna work. It's not gonna solve anything, it's gonna make things worse. And so we created a message guide about how to talk about these challenges. So you'll find that here, if you go to our resources page, that's my tee up, but I'm glad to be here in conversation and I'll be here the rest of the day. Thanks.
Thank you. I know you all here in Maine have a lot to teach the rest of the country. I hope you have a sense from what you've heard so far that there's a lot to learn from the rest of the country too, even from the South. I'm going to try to out-Southern some of you guys. I'm from Alabama originally. Get more Southern than that. We have a lot to learn from each other across the country, and it's my perspective that many communities are doing a lot of things right and nobody's doing it perfectly. And so we need to be in conversations like this where we're sharing what's working in different parts of the country. We know that it's not going to be cookie cutter either, that you know, different places have different realities. The rural nature of Maine, the small town nature of Maine, the geographic spread here it's tough. I mean, I used to work in New Mexico, similar, right, where there are kind of pockets of population and then a lot of rural areas, a lot of small towns, tribal communities. So hopefully we can use the time today to learn from one another, not just from the folks on the panel, but as you're in conversations over lunch and in conversations in the breakouts as the day goes on. I want to come back and pick up on a few different threads that I heard here, because you've got a really interesting mix of voices up here and a lot of issues just got raised. I want to go back, Noah, to something that you said, and that was that the needs of the people that DESC is serving have gotten more complex over time. And, this is a conversation that I have with folks around the country. We've always had a lot of folks with mental illness, a lot of trauma histories, a lot of substance use, a lot of barriers that people face. And sometimes it has struck me that the homelessness movement has shied away from talking about some of those issues because we've been afraid of re-stigmatizing people or of sending the message that addiction causes homelessness, that it's a root cause, some of these sort of traps that people can fall into. But what it has meant is we don't always talk about the fact that things have gotten tough. And the drug and alcohol crisis in this country, the post-pandemic mental health crisis, which has gotten much worse, we're seeing a level of complex needs that I'm not sure was quite as intense and severe when I was a direct service provider. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. I would agree with that. I like to push back. I hear a lot in my community in Seattle that there's the acuity of the people we serve has really increased, or something about the people has changed. And I try to push back on that. I think the systems that are designed to meet people's needs have changed and failed. I don't think the people have changed. And I think that's an important distinction to make, is that there's an othering that happens when we do that and we think about that. What I've seen happen, certainly the pandemic it created a dynamic that exacerbated the fact that Washington State, for example, is 47th per capita in mental health services in terms of beds and resources available across the country. So we were always working with not enough in our community. As the pandemic hit and what resources were available that arguably weren't necessarily tailored to meet the needs of people with the most profound and serious disabling conditions in the first place became less available. And so needs just became more and more pronounced and profound. And we continue to, I think, deal with the fallout of all of that. I think we need to acknowledge a few things. One of the things that I hear, and we as housing providers, we do shelter work and outreach work and outpatient behavioral health work at my organization as well. I think we talk, and rightly so, that housing first, permanent supportive housing is the solution to people experiencing chronic homelessness and many other groups of people too. And wholeheartedly that is true, but I think sometimes lost in that is some sort of expectation that it means people's problems go away. And I think we need to be clear that that is not inherently the case. People invariably do better. The evidence supports that overwhelmingly, but that doesn't mean complex behavioral health conditions that are not well supported by a larger network that has tons of cracks, of which the highest needs people fall through, isn't designed to meet their needs and isn't. And so we should just be full-throated about that and not allow that to be a critique of the housing first movement. I hear that a lot. Is that, well, if you build these housing programs, why do people still have problems? And it ignores the complexity of what people are living with and lets off the hook all the inflows into homelessness. We're just ignoring all the reasons why people fall in when we blame resources for not addressing somebody's really complex and profound challenges. I think we also need to think about how our services are designed. In light of that fact, we need to be doing external advocacy work to enhance, in the case of Washington, as I said, our access and availability to mental health resources. But how do we also think about the services we directly control? Can we design things differently? Is the same old model of how we deliver outreach or how we design a permanent supportive housing program still meet the needs of our clients now, 20 years on? Maybe not. Maybe we need to think about more interdisciplinary teams. Maybe we need to think about how do we have some, for example, crisis resources that aren't the emergency room and aren't, no offense, someone with a badge and a gun. That was never the system in place. That was never how we wanted crisis services or resources to be deployed inherently, but that was all that was available to us. Can we think about designing ways to reach people in behavioral health crisis in more conventional and more unconventional, client-centered, trauma-informed ways? The answer is yes. How do we talk about that? How do we fund that? And invariably, it's done in partnership with hospital systems, police systems, first responders, and we're starting to see some positive effect there. But there's a light at the end of the tunnel for us in Seattle on some of this stuff, but we're not there yet. We're still dealing with these challenges, and so I don't want to paint a picture of we've got it, but we've got some ideas that are showing some promise.
Great. I wonder if anybody else would like to speak to this intersection with mental health and substance use.
No, I was going to expand on that. Like the complexity that we're seeing in our community are older adults. It's like a 40% increase of people, and pick your age limit, right? So part of our opportunity as a continuum of care is to learn the language that older adult or senior services have so that we can partner together. And so we're seeing behavioral health challenges, but more and more chronic medical issues and mobility challenges. And we're not designed to meet those needs. Or we all learned the phrase like activities of daily living. We didn't used to talk about incontinence and homelessness, and now it is a very present and real challenge, right? So I think it's understanding, and that is a change in systems. No, I love how you said that. As housing costs have gone up, people on fixed incomes cannot keep up because, we can't just say, well, go get another job or get a better paying job. That's not always an option.
Yeah, and I've seen that in the data from Maine too. I think older adults are your fastest growing population. That is true nationally as well. It's not just Maine and Virginia. We're seeing that trend over the last 2 or 3 years, and it's very troublesome. Others want to address this line of inquiry around complex needs?
Yeah, one of the things we've done in Dallas is we've got a first of its kind waiver from HUD that allows us to utilize PSH supportive services dollars to pay case rate for behavioral health. So we're working through, and I also don't want to paint a picture that we've got this figured out. It's very difficult to integrate an entire behavioral health care system into our existing homeless response system. But what it allows us to do is to utilize those COC dollars to integrate behavioral health into services as soon as people get housed. We are integrating that into our encampment work, so they're actually connected to the behavioral health care system prior to moving in. And then also using those dollars to build out ACT and ICM teams as well to try to match people with more intensive behavioral health supports as soon as they move into housing.
Joel, I wonder if we can switch gears and talk about law enforcement for a minute. The questions came up earlier. We heard some really compelling personal experiences and bearing witness to some of the ways that people are treated. We know that law enforcement interfaces with people experiencing homelessness all the time.
Absolutely.
We heard Hannah say earlier that part of their strategy in Dallas, once they close an encampment and move people into housing, is to make sure that encampment doesn't come back. And so that it sort of implies after the fact law enforcement around a space that maybe the city doesn't want to see encampments continue perpetually. So you've seen this from all angles. You've seen it as a law enforcement officer, a leader in law enforcement. You've seen it now as a landlord engagement person and part of the kind of response system to homelessness. What do you think works best around, how can law enforcement be a good partner? And then I think, as importantly, what can folks in this room do to be part of the solution on that?
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. Well, I think the first thing that you have to look at is education for the law enforcement. Okay, that's really huge. The education portion of, teaching them about homelessness, how people have come into homelessness, that everybody who's homeless is not a bad person, that teaching them about the mental illness and substance abuse aspects of homelessness. And then also, I think one of the main things is having them have a resource to reach out to if they run into this problem. If they come across someone that is experienced homeless, they're trying to problem solve. The reason why they're getting called there is because it is a generated call. Someone has called in, and you have to understand, it's just like your agencies. If someone calls in and says, we have something that you need to address, you got to address it. A lot of times we get calls from the mayor, all right? You got to address that issue. It's no different than law enforcement. When you have a call, you have to address that issue. It's coming from a citizen, and they don't, and a lot of times when it's coming in, they're watching you. They're watching to see what you did, okay? So you really don't have an out. But what we've been afforded is, one thing is that because I got involved with this in my district, one of the things that I looked at said, we need to educate our officers. I used to bring my lieutenant with me to different meetings so they had understanding, and then bring the night shift lieutenants. And then we started circulating the homeless program education into our roll calls, all right? That was one of the main things. But it's not easy to get into police agencies. Is it true? Is that a true statement? It's tough to get in there. One of the things that we did to try to get into the police agencies, when you talk to agencies, you can't just go in and say, we have an issue and we need your help. You got to go in there and talk to them about, I just wrote down some things I want to cover with you. Time on scene. How much time are your officers spending on scene? Okay? How much time are your officers spending on scene dealing with this homeless individual when they need to be dealing with the armed robbery? How much money are your officers per hour, per minute? How much is that costing you? Then you got to talk about the use of force, okay? You got to talk about use of force. You got to look and say, how many times has officers have to lay hands on somebody when if you had resources in place, they wouldn't have to? All right? That's how you talk to the chiefs. You talk to them about time on scene. You talk to them about how much money that they're spending for officers handling these calls when they shouldn't have to be. Use of force. We have the hotline. We have a hotline that's afforded for officers to call if they actually have a situation with a homeless individual. You also got to get partnerships there. You have to have partnerships with your churches. You have to have partnerships with your missions. You have to have partnerships with your hotels. All right? You have to have all those partnerships in place. And that requires you going sometimes door to door. You can't do it from an email. You can't do it from a Zoom. You have to get out there face to face, and you got to talk those things, especially when we're talking about a police agency. You would think that this would be something that a police agency would be like, man, this is a no-brainer. I want to be a part of this. But sometimes you have to talk, what is the benefit of them? There has to be a benefit for them, all right? And when you start talking about them being able to provide more services to other locations, that's a good benefit.
It's also struck me over the years that when there is a good, I don't want to say, I'm going to say it anyway, a good officer on the inside who really cares about this stuff and is approaching it in a humane way, they can be an incredible force for change within a police force.
Absolutely.
I used to be a trainer at police academies and with crisis intervention teams in police departments, and I remember Sergeant Gene Pettit from 25 years ago who was changing his department from within.
Right.
Because he cared about this. He cared about homelessness. He cared about mental illness. And he was a big, tough, muscly guy. And people listened to him in a way they weren't listening to me or other service providers. And so I think developing real allies within departments can be a powerful thing, too, whatever level they're at. I mean, he was not the police chief. He was up there, but not up there.
Right.
Anybody else want to address this issue of policing?
Yeah, I would like to. Joel, you gave such a great list and example of how to connect and why to connect with different audiences based on what they care about. So the examples that Joel just gave is like an excellent strategy that every community and every organization really should have about how are we going to do XYZ to change how a police officer or an entire department is engaging with our people, right? Is like, you can't just go in and say, well, you can go in and say, I'm mad, and you'll get a certain response. But to so a lot of what this little yellow square here about audiences is about, it's not enough to just say a lot of stuff or to like publish stuff on a comm schedule. If we really want to make change, we have to be strategic. Who do we need to talk to? Who's the right messenger? Who's that person who's inside, who's gonna carry that when you're not in the room? And what do you need to connect with people on to get them to actually be part of the change, part of on board with what your vision is? And so, time on scene, money, whether or not people are being physically at risk is a list of how you might talk to a police department about it. And if you're talking to the people at the American Legion, they probably are really motivated by values that are rooted in security and autonomy and freedom, right? And so do we have talking points at the ready where we're gonna talk about how housing first is actually a model that allows people to have autonomy and freedom to decide how they're gonna spend their days? And if we want a secure, healthy community, people being inside their homes and connected with services is going to make them more secure, and it's also going to move people off the streets, right? That's a direction for that. Whereas if you're talking to an LGBT group at an elite university, right, like they might already think poverty's bad and homelessness is bad, and so your work there is to move them into action. Like, hey, do you know that like trans and queer people are X amount of the people experiencing homelessness in Portland? I invite you to join us in doing this, right? So how are we being strategic about how we're connecting with people is a next level of doing big narrative change work. It's not enough to say this, right?
Thank you very much. Absolutely, well put. One thing I wanted to tell you about how to get this information, about how long the officers are on scene. You can get in contact with your 911 center, all right? They keep a chronological log of what calls that the officers go to, how long they're on scene, and the outcome of the encounter. And that's how you build your information. You got to do some data. You got to put some data together here. You want to have your sharpest data people on this, all right? But you go in there armed with that information. Your officer spent 1,444 hours, doing this particular function. Okay, if you start talking, reducing that by, 50%, they're going to listen, all right? But you got to go in there armed and prepared, all right? And then also, if you have an advocate in the police agency, go in there with them, all right? And if you don't have one, give me a call. I'll go in with you.
Thank you for that. I want to go back to something that I think both Kelly and Hannah, you guys talked about in your opening comments, and that is how our homelessness systems can work better and how we can transform them. So, Kelly, I want to start with you. You talked a lot about COC governance, and I know Maine is at a crossroads around this, as I talked about. You all are establishing an executive director position. There's, I know, various statewide groups meeting and task forces and the continuum of care. What advice would you have for the folks in this room around continuum of care governance, and I think striking that balance between process and structure on the one hand and action and impact that Mark talked about earlier?
Yeah, so thank you, Jeff. I think, so first I want to say that I was fortunate to work with Dean in our state, so I think y'all are in good hands. So that's a good start. But I think, there's a lot of, thinking about how do you do system change and sustain it over time. And you really do have to balance doing something, describing it, writing it down, and then getting ready to change it, but understanding, like, how are we going to change it? When are we going to change it, right? Because, the only way through a difficult time is really through. Because if you do a workaround, you might end up someplace where you didn't intend to be. And so the thing about governance is that you start somewhere, you document it, you're collaborative as you can be, and then you revisit it, right? I mean, this is an iterative process. I've been doing it for 21 years, and there's always something crazy happening in homelessness, but the crazy changes, so that keeps it fresh, which, that's the plus. But it's really knowing that we're in it together and having a way to facilitate difficult decisions, right? And I think but it comes back to why we're doing it. Like, we're doing this because everyone in our community deserves a safe place to live. And always coming, like, that's always your touch point. And if what we're doing together is about all of us feeling good or, just like some process goals, you're never going to get to, but people in our community should have a safe place to live. How do we get there?
Thank you for that, Kelly. And Hannah, you described a pretty remarkable transformation in the Dallas system. I've been there. I've seen the work you all are doing. How did you do that? How did you sort of move it from this old mindset that you talked about to something that's achieving the results that you're seeing now?
Yeah, I think it's easy to sit up here and I think make it sound like, oh, Dallas has it all together. And I think in a lot of ways, compared to my experience as an outreach worker, we have come light years, but that is slow, incremental change. Mm-hmm. We just pulled off one of the most successful street-to-home initiatives. We housed over 100 people in under 100 days, which is incredible.
That's good.
That was the largest encampment that we had ever done. 3 years ago when we started with encampments that had 4 to 5 people at them. And then we're constantly figuring out, how do you tweak the process and make it better? How do we get feedback from the outreach workers, feedback from the people that actually lived in the encampments, and then implement that feedback into our strategy and process? But yeah, it is highly collaborative and it is slow and incremental, but it's done with a intentionality and laser focus. There were, I think, upwards of 17 organizations involved in that initiative where we housed that many people in under 100 days. I do not care where anyone works. I don't care that we have different mission statements and goals, different staffing structures and supervisors. I care that we are there to house people and do it as effectively as possible, as quickly as possible, with as much transparency and urgency. So that's, I think, having a very specific laser focus and doing it incrementally over time has led to a lot of the success that we've seen.
Yeah.
No, I wonder if you might want to add to this. I know Seattle, King County has had a lot of challenges around coordinating across the system, across the region. There's a relatively new homeless services authority for the region. DESC is one of the big players in town around providing housing and services. Kind of what's working and what hard lessons have you all learned?
Yeah, thanks. To speak as from the provider lens, we have a large COC organization, management organization that is actually a newer development where an effort between Seattle and the suburban jurisdictions of King County, the county in which it sits, all convened into one governing agency was the idea. It was a recommendation to have a regional approach to solving homelessness. And I think it's fair to say it's been fledgling at best. Only recently did that organization kind of lose some of its heft, and that the local governments took back some of its decision-making power and now is transferring into more of kind of a contract management agency, which I think is really unfortunate. I was really rooting for this organization to succeed and serve as the community-wide vision for ending homelessness. I would say Seattle doesn't have one of those. The King County region doesn't have one of those. I mean, we put names to things that sound like we do, but it is certainly not a regional coordinated effort. And I think there's something to be said for that is tricky. Homelessness is a hot button issue. I don't need to tell you that. It certainly is more in Seattle than ever before. And I think there was a mistake in that the idea that local electeds could somehow outsource their responsibility to resolve homelessness, and it created an issue with the voters that caused a lot of, I think, blame on this otherwise potentially really promising organization that could have laid out a vision and a plan, and that hasn't quite happened. I think a couple lessons learned too is the theory of change for this organization was centering the voice of people with lived experience, which, amen, that's the right move. I've had a lot of experience trying to center that same principle at DESC, and I will tell you it is easy to give language to that. It's a lot harder to do that in a meaningful, impactful, empowering way, and I don't think they succeeded in doing that. That created some challenges. And I also think there's a piece that is a little tricky. While I agree that should be the centering principle, I do worry for people for whom have some of the greatest challenges and who have been disempowered and marginalized. Just saying you have a voice in the process isn't enough, is tricky. And sometimes the people who work with those folks, providers like DESC, I think can serve as a great conduit, proxy, and support for having those conversations. And I've been disheartened by the role providers have been kind of pushed out of coordinating directly with our COC on how best to work with people, how best to design systems. So kind of better alignment between people, programs, and governing would be my recommendation. That is easier said than done. Again, we're hearing kind of a mix of inspiration and ideas on the one hand and cautionary tales on the other. I've got one more question for the panel, and then I think we've got time for one or two questions from the audience, and then we'll wrap up. Grover, I'm really glad you guys put this, and Dean, in the program today. It's good messaging. I put a big circle around the big circle there, the persuadables. I think we spent a lot of time thinking about how to either talk within our own echo chamber with people we agree with, or directly do combat with people we disagree with. And we often forget about that middle part of the change curve that Everett Rogers talks about in diffusion of innovation, these sort of early adopters, late adopters, majority, late majority. Who are these persuadables? How do we talk to them? What's your advice for this group?
Right. Well, the persuadables are the majority of people in this country and likely in your communities. And persuadables are reflective generally of the general population, unlike some of our other groups. Like opposition tends to be more white, more homeowners, more higher income people, for example, and the base tends to be more Black folks, more Democrats, more renters, right? So there are demographic trends in the other two ones, but persuadables literally could be anyone demographically, and also are the vast majority of people, and they're definitely the vast majority of people who are not having sustained engagement around solutions to homelessness and affordable housing. And we have that little chart there, And we started including this little tiny circle of insiders because we realized that when we were training people, mostly we train people who are in the housing and homelessness field. We often think that what we think and what our best friend thinks and what our leaders that we've built up from the base, what they think is the messages we should be using. And that is, in fact, the opposite logic of what we need to actually bring more people into this work with us and really change things. And so the persuadables, some people call them the movable middle. Really, what is one thing to remember is that people who are persuadable, often it's not like they're just centrist politically. That's a misunderstanding. It's actually that people can hold complex or sometimes competing ideas. And I know this is true for myself. There are some issues on which I'm a persuadable person. I can be like, I don't like that, but also I don't like this. And so when you give me this message, I feel compelled, and I also feel compelled this way. And so really who wins is who got the airtime to get to that person while they were making up their mind. And so this is true about housing or homelessness. People who are persuadable might think that government should get out of the way. Generally, they might think that people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps. They might subscribe to that sort of discourse, but they also might think everyone should have a home. Homelessness is actually not good, and I don't think that arresting and ticketing people is going to solve it. And so they could go either way. And so when they hear the opposition's message, they can be compelled, and when they hear our message, they can be compelled. So our work, really, as a field right now, is if we want to make big change and win, get our elected leaders to feel like they need to do what we're saying they need to do, we need to get this persuadable audience, communicate with them more, and move them more into the base, or at least just win when it's time for them to vote, or when we want them to not come out and oppose our new shelter site, for example. Those are the persuadable audiences.
Great, thank you. We've got time for a couple of questions from the audience. Do we have the ability to run mics? So just one or two, and I'm going to ask questioners be brief and panelists be brief. It looks like there's one over here.
Hi, I'm Zachary Moore, person with lived experience in long-term recovery. I'm also a recovery coach and SIP certified in peer support. The question is for Kelly, but I think Noah touched on it too. As a person with lived experience, I've been trying to get involved in our COC, but I kind of find myself feeling a little out of my element. Is there something y'all do there in Virginia, or what can we do here in Maine to like either counsel or get folks trained or educated on when we, there's a lot of enticements and incentives to join these meetings, but are we educated enough to actually participate? I think Noah just touched on this, how can we really get involved? And, I was actually asked to join our governance committee, but I backed away because I wasn't educated enough. I was busy, life was happening. Yeah. And so that was very unfortunate, but I just would like to know, how do we get folks more educated and able to actually come to the table to help make decisions? This stuff's real important, so thank you.
Wow, thank you for that question. I think like so many things that everyone has been sharing, it's a matter of translation and being really clear about what it is you're trying to accomplish, right? And so when we talk to people experiencing homelessness in our community, we're either, we do 2 point-in-time counts a year that include like qualitative questions. So that's sort of our base way that we are always listening and engaging. And so we just have a number of ways that we engage. So there's no one way to get that input and to engage people who are closest to this crisis. But thinking about how do you train and equip people, like having a list of acronyms and maybe doing an orientation, personalized orientation in advance. We also recently have started a group of service providers with lived experience, like to get their input. So they may not need to add another job onto what they're currently doing to governance, but we still benefit by expanding those conversations. But I think it's education, clarity, and then understanding which words we use and what they mean. So, but thank you. And I would say don't give up, but also think about Like maybe you could say, hey, this is what I could do and this is what I'd like to offer, not just those terms don't work for me, because that's real, but say, well, look, I mean, I'm happy to, host a focus group, and maybe you start there. I mean, we certainly haven't perfected it. We're always trying to think about it, but we know 25% of our workforce has lived experience, including at our, agency. We're a planning agency. So just keep at it, I'd say.
Does anybody else want to add to that? Okay, time for one or two other questions back here, and then maybe up here, and then we'll wind it down.
Hey, Johnny. Oh, I'll take it.
Oh, sorry. So it's kind of a narrative question, so I'll direct it at Grover, but the rest of you may have experience with narratives as well. So first off, I think the tools in here from the Narrative Lab are awesome. That's really, really cool. Thanks for bringing that. And my name is Johnny Karsfeld. I'm the Director of Planning and Research at Maine Housing, which puts me in communications and marketing too. So what struck me is for those persuadables who shift the terminology to like economic terms, which is right for speaking to your audience. But I think there's kind of a meta-narrative thing as well that, right, when we speak in terms of values, you get branded as an activist. And I don't think that was always true in America. And I wonder if like what's the extent to which values-based narrative should be tied in even when we're speaking to persuadable audiences in order to kind of shift the underlying feeling about, values are still a part of why we're trying to address homelessness, even if there are these economic benefits that we can focus on in that conversation, right?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for your feedback and your question. You are compelling me to edit this slide for the next time we pull it out, which is that at the Housing Narrative Lab, we generally think that no matter who you're communicating with, you should always start with a values-based message. It's just that the values that an insider holds and a persuadable audience holds are often slightly different. Although I will say, we have it here in our big shared narrative, the opening sentence, no matter our race, gender, or income, we all need a safe place to sleep. In Minnesota, in Tulsa, over and over again, that race and class inclusive message and gender inclusive message rates the highest. People resonate with it across persuadables, base, and insiders. So always start with a values-based message. And our findings from this specific research found that talking about economics, and we don't mean like $27,000 went to blah, blah, blah. It's more like the rents are rising and wages don't keep up with the cost of housing. That's the kind of message that persuadables who do not follow our insider news of what is in and out, they're like, yeah, that's true. That reflects with my life. And then you use that as a way to go to more values to say, and because of that, no one should experience homelessness because the jobs don't pay enough, right? Like that. So it's using what they care about and what they resonate with as an entry. And also, we're never just going to say one message to them. So you get them with what they resonate with, and then you can deepen the conversation to move into different kinds of values and solutions.
We got time for one more brief question, and then we'll wrap up.
Hi, my name is Nikisha. I am the hub coordinator for Cumberland County. I had a question around DV, survivor, and anti-trafficking. We are, in our case, conferencing through coordinated entry, through conversations around Built for Zero, through the work that we do in the hub. We're trying to find ways to better engage with clients who are experiencing domestic violence. We just don't see the resources there. We have, in comparison, I have like 1,300 people on my mainstream list, but I only have 24 on my domestic violence list. Finding resources for them, finding shelter for them where they don't feel like they need to go back to their abuser or stay in those abusive situations is the topic of every conversation that we have, because in almost every meeting we see that that has happened with someone on our list. So I want to ask, what have you done in your communities, or what are you trying to do in your communities through engagement, through housing initiatives, through resource efforts with the state or federally to get additional funding?
You just decided to go ahead and end us on a really hard question, then. That was good. Any thoughts on that? Anything you all have seen success around in your communities?
I mean, I'll share. So we have, I'll just start by saying I don't know all the funding sources that our domestic violence partners have, but we have some partners funded through our coordinated public funding processes in homelessness. So we've had domestic violence partners as just a part of our continuum of care for a really long time. I mean, it started, again, collaborative personalities. You start with the willing and then build it out. And so we actually rely on those partners to tell us what their needs are, but they get funding for rapid rehousing as part of our collaborative effort. They're really great at that. They also know that housing stability is what gives a survivor an option not to make the best choice, which may be terrible. So they leverage all of the funding that they have access to. We do collaborate on some funding opportunities, and then we're still trying to get more federal funding for domestic violence. There's some federal bonuses. It hasn't worked yet, but we're submitting at the end of this month, and we're really hopeful. So it's constant communication, but we rely on the expertise of those agencies doing that work because they're really focused and intentional, and then we try to partner with them. Because when we talk to people experiencing homelessness, I mean, the percentage of people with that experience of abuse and trauma is really high. And so we sort of but if it's immediate or imminent, then we sort of divide and conquer.
We're going to pause it there. Thank you all for your questions. I would encourage you to come find the panelists afterwards and continue to engage with them. I've got one very quick question to close us on, and we're just going to do a lightning round. We'll start with Joel and just move down the line. I did not prep them on this, by the way. In 10 seconds or less, what gives you hope?
What gives me hope is everyone being in this room.
That we know what works. We just need to scale it.
Yeah, having the opportunity to know my unhoused neighbors by name, know their stories, and then have the opportunity to say welcome home at the end of the whole process. How can you not get up and go to work every day?
It's just all the people we work with, from those outside to those in seats of power and money.
Gives me hope is the scale of tenant rights organizing, especially happening with people under 40 across the country in a way that I've never seen in my lifetime.
Thank you all so much for your good work. Thank you for making the effort to come to Portland, and thank you all for your attention.
All right, we have a fun thing to do before we break for lunch. So if I could ask Michelle, oh, you're right here, Michelle, and Greg Payne to come on up for a minute. Jeff earlier this morning talked about self-care, and even in my advanced age, I've learned a little bit the last couple of years, and I walk through the woods. I heard there's a Japanese term for it called forest bathing, which is kind of cool. So I try to do that. And then I think organizationally, we learned a long, long time ago, because the work is so hard and can be super sad sometimes, we have, as an agency, really tried to care for ourselves as well, and we do celebrations and awards and congratulate each other. In fact, real quickly, this email came in this morning from the wonderful guy who runs our street outreach team, and he said, 3 cheers for a housing placement. Hey, street outreach team, I want to lift up some amazing work happening today. Bob's client, Johnny, is moving into his apartment that he got with the help from Bob and this whole team. You are crushing it, Bob, for a program that was stripped of its vouchers. and yet you still continue to plow forward with clients, checking every nook and cranny you can for anything they need. So things like that as an agency are important for us. I also think it's important for all of us, you know, as a movement and as partners and as collaborators to also celebrate. And so Michelle is going to help with that and talk a little bit about the Housing First work that you've heard a lot about this morning. So thank you, Michelle, for coming.
Hello, everyone. My name is Michelle Dukas, and I moved into the First Housing Program at Houston Commons 7 years ago. I grew up in the Oxford Hills area with my 2 sons, and unfortunately, a fire took our home and left us nothing but the cat. I made my way to Portland, you know, thinking big city, big opportunities, but unfortunately, I was homeless for 5 years, and homelessness is not a life I saw for my future. It quickly became a lifestyle because of the way you need to live it, and it is an unchosen lifestyle. The Housing First program has the building steps to provide for myself and others stability, boost our confidence, and to grow into people that can be physically and mentally functional and able to have a healthy and safe life, have a full-time job, pay rent, to own a car. But in the beginning, on day 1, I can't say I wasn't overwhelmed. As acclimated as I was to being on the floor at the shelter, I slept on the floor of my apartment for the first month. I needed time. Oh, sorry. It didn't take me long to get to know the staff at Houston Commons and to know that I could trust them. And to this day, I don't consider them just staff. They are my friends. They've helped me connect to anyone I needed to assist in details of my life that were holding me back. One of the biggest was clearing up some fraudulent debt of thousands of dollars, and because of that being corrected, I was able to get my license back. Another is that they made it possible to have overnight visits with my children so I could see them as much as possible, and they too have also watched them grow in the 7 years that I've been there. At one point, I stupidly managed to break both of my ankles at the same time, and to my rescue, and to my horror, they came and bore witness to my clumsiness because they came and got me and brought me back up to my apartment until I could go to the hospital. That we can laugh at now. My biggest moment of need came when I got sick. I got very sick with liver disease. The staff were there for me immediately. They called every time I was hospitalized, a lot. Asked me how I was doing, do I need anything from home? And as I was restricted to basically do nothing at home by my doctor, they got me set up with a PSS to make sure that my home was still clean and healthy and me not push myself too much. Today I stand here 2 weeks from being 1 year sober. If I were still homeless, if not for the Housing First program, and if not for my friends and the staff at Houston Commons, I may not be standing here at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle, and congratulations on your anniversary. So Michelle was unbelievably brave to come up here and tell that story. And But we did think it would be great to, if somebody wanted to talk about what Housing First has meant to them. And that's related to the celebration we wanted to do. And not only, I mean, celebrations are great. I think surprises are even better. So we're surprising somebody with an award today. If Greg Payne would like to come up to receive his award, Greg. I told Greg we wanted him for the photo op for an award, you know, representing the governor, but really we wanted Greg here. So where to start? You know, because I know we got to go to lunch, and I know he's a humble man, and he won't want me to go too far. But Greg started this work in homelessness as a Jesuit volunteer right out of college. He worked for the Atlanta Coalition for the Homeless, and JVs are near and dear to my heart. I've known dozens, I think, over my life, and so finding out Greg was a JV was just an added bonus when I first met him. He was a JV for not 1 year, but 2, and then he stayed on at the Coalition in Atlanta for a few years working and decided to make this kind of his life work. He moved up to Massachusetts and worked for the Massachusetts Coalition for the Homeless and worked there for a few years, and then decided to go to law school in order to be a better advocate for people experiencing homelessness. That was pushed him into law school. He did a brief, after law school, he did a brief, ill-fated path in a soul-sucking law firm job, from what I understand. And then one day showed up at the Preble Street soup kitchen and asked if there might be any jobs in Portland that he could, that fit his work and his background and his interest and his passion and his values. So as many of you know, he ended up at Avesta Housing for 16 or 18, 16 years, something like that, a long time at Avesta Housing, did great work with them. He also, as part of that role, was the staff person for the Maine Affordable Housing Coalition. Also at the national level, was on the board of the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and it became the board president at the national level as well. Michelle being here is so perfect because Greg was actually the chief development officer for Houston Commons when he was at Avesta, one of his many, many great projects. Then Governor Mills did what she kind of became known for fairly quickly after becoming governor, and that is getting really smart people to come work for her, which is a sign of terrific leadership. She surrounded herself with really smart people, and she poached Greg from Avesta, and he has been the senior policy advisor on housing to Governor Mills for 3 years now, I think, right? Yeah. 3 years. And I have a feeling he's probably worked with just about everybody in this room and many, many, many others. Has been involved in, you know, pandemic kind of wind down work, has been involved tremendous leadership in responding to the influx of asylum seekers and their families, been the lead on developing shelters, short-term, long-term housing for that population, has, you know, corralled kittens in ways that many people, I don't think, would be able to, because besides the core values he brings, he is also a great problem solver. And that's a really important trait, one that came to the forefront, at least for me, during the pandemic, when you had to get shit done, right, really quickly, and you decided to work with people who could solve problems. And Greg is unbelievable at that, working with municipalities, with businesses, with landlords, with developers, with state legislators, has fantastic relationships, has built trust across the aisle and across the state. So we wanted to celebrate Greg, surprise Greg. So we are giving him a Force for Good award. 2024, we have a picture of Houston Commons, and then a picture of Greg with his wife Nicole, and a few other chuckleheads. And at a time to be determined, we're going to have plant a tree in Houston Commons in his honor, and that'll be another excuse to have a celebration, and we'll do so with all the tenants at Houston Commons. So thank you, Greg. Congratulations, my friend. Michelle, come on in.
Wow, that was super sneaky. I should have known. Will you be there for a photo op? I was like, wow. Thanks, Swanee. Thank you, everyone. Really, I guess there's two things I think I want to say. One, well, Michelle, thank you for sharing your story. I so appreciate that. Thinking about the Housing First initiative that we're going to talk about this afternoon, one of the things that has been really clear to me is in talking with the governor and with Jeremy Kennedy, the governor's chief of staff, who is here. Thank you for being here, Jeremy. And Hannah Pingree, and as we were talking about this initiative, I do believe that the reason that the governor went to the legislature at her State of the State address and said, send me a Housing First expansion bill and I will sign it. I think that the single largest driver of how she came to that conclusion was because of the success of the 3 Housing First projects we already have. And I just want to ask Brittany, the other folks here in the room who have been the staff at Logan Place and Florence House and Houston Commons, working with people struggling through some of the most difficult parts of their lives. Would you stand, the staff, Tessa, too, who's been working with the people who so need your help? The reality is Housing First works. And they not only have demonstrated that as staff, but they did so with data. And so when we came and had conversations with the governor about this and with members of the legislature about this, Republican members of the legislature, there's a lot of support on the Republican side for this. It was data-driven success that we were able to put in front of policymakers, and it made that decision so much easier. And so I just, again, want to thank you for the work that you've done on the ground to make that so. Please, I hope you own the progress that is yet to come on Housing First. It's your success and your fantastic work that helped get it there. The other thing I just briefly wanted to say, I feel like when you strip away all of the politics and the acronyms we were talking around and all the other horseshit that goes into kind of making something happen in the world that benefits people who are struggling. In the end, it's about loving your neighbor. That's fundamentally what it's about. And I just want to say thank you to Preble Street, to the other folks in this room who every day get up and love their neighbor. And even when it's difficult and painful, and especially for the folks that you're working with, it is so very difficult and painful. You get up and do it every day and love people again the next day and go do big and important things. So thank you to Preble Street for this award. Thank you all for your partnership. And I do want you to know that from my vantage point, working with your governor, she cares deeply about ending homelessness. Her heart is full of love. It is why she has been the housing governor. It is why she has supported Housing First and $75 million in emergency housing relief funds and $315 million in housing investments. Between her and Jeremy and Hannah and other leaders, they have a heart that demands the action. They know it is not just good policy, it's good humanity. And I just want you all to know that about your governor, because she wants to keep doing good work in her remaining 2 years. So again, thank you so much. Thank you for your partnership.